The door hit her in the back before she even made it off the porch. Not swung shut by the wind, pushed by her own uncle's hand. "Don't come back," Harold Whitlock said. His voice didn't shake, didn't crack. He said it the way a man says, "Get out of my chair," flat, irritated, already done with the conversation. He didn't look at her face. He looked somewhere past her left shoulder, like she was already gone, already erased. "The land deed's in the envelope. That's everything you're owed. That's everything." Mara stood on the bottom step with $17 in her coat pocket and a paper envelope pressed against her chest. She was 18 years old. She weighed more than any of her cousins, more than the town seemed comfortable with, and right now she was being handed the deed to a piece of rock nobody wanted so that her uncle could stop feeling guilty about keeping the rest. She didn't cry, not yet. She just stood there in the cold morning air and looked back at the house she'd spent the last 4 years calling home, and thought, with startling clarity, "If I turn around and beg, he'll let me sleep in the barn. That's what he'll offer, the barn." She didn't turn around. If you've ever been handed the worst possible thing and told to be grateful for it, this story is for you. Stay until the end. And if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Mara's story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The envelope was thin. That was the first thing Mara noticed, how thin it was, how little space a person's entire inheritance could occupy. She didn't open it until she'd walked far enough down the road that the Whitlock house disappeared behind the tree line. Then she sat on a split-rail fence she didn't recognize in a county she barely knew and pulled out the deed. Hollow Ridge, 42 acres. She'd heard the name exactly once before, when her father was still alive. He'd mentioned it offhand, the way men mentioned things they didn't value. "Oh, there's that piece out at Hollow Ridge. Nothing but rock and scrub. Your grandfather always said it was a waste of a good afternoon just getting there." She'd been maybe 12 at the time. She hadn't paid much attention. Now she read every word on that deed twice. Her father's name was on it, his father's before that. And now, by the thin legal thread of a handwritten transfer at the bottom, it was hers. She folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. 42 acres of rock and scrub, $17. The clothes on her back and a canvas bag that held one change of clothes, a pocket knife, a box of matches, and a small photograph of her mother she hadn't been able to leave behind. She sat with that inventory for a long moment. Then she stood up, hitched the bag higher on her shoulder, and started walking toward town. She hadn't eaten since the night before, and the walk to Callows Creek was 3 miles on a road that turned to mud in the low spots. By the time she reached Main Street, her boots were heavy with it, and her stomach was making noises she was grateful no one could hear. The town was already moving. Wagons, dogs, a pair of men arguing outside the feed store about something she didn't catch. Nobody looked at her directly. A few looked at her indirectly, the way people do when they're watching without wanting to be caught at it. She knew that look. She'd worn it directed at herself in every mirror for the last few years. The general store was run by a woman named Dolores Fenn, who was 50-something and sharp as a thumbtack, and had the particular talent of making every transaction feel like a negotiation you were losing. Mara had met her twice before, briefly, when accompanying Harold's wife on supply runs. Dolores had the kind of memory that never lost a face, but frequently misplaced a name. "You're the Whitlock girl," Dolores said when Mara walked in. Not a question. "Mara," she said, "Harold's niece." Dolores set down the bolt of fabric she was measuring and studied Mara with the kind of look that catalogs a person from shoes to hairline in about 3 seconds. "You look like you've been walking." "I have been." "Hungry?" The question surprised her. She hadn't expected directness about it. "I'm fine," she said, which was the answer she always gave and almost never meant. Dolores made a small sound that might have been disbelief and reached under the counter for a biscuit wrapped in a cloth. She set it in front of Mara without further comment. Mara looked at it, looked at Dolores. "I didn't ask for charity." "I know you didn't. It's from yesterday, and I'm not going to eat it, and if you don't take it, I'll feed it to the cat, who is already fat and doesn't need it." Dolores picked up her fabric again. "Now, what are you here to buy?" Mara ate the biscuit in 3 bites and then placed her list on the counter. She'd written it that morning with a stub of pencil on the back of the envelope. A hand axe, a coil of rope, 2 wool blankets, a tin cup, basic flour and dried beans, a small saw. Dolores looked at the list, looked at Mara. Where are you going? Hollow Ridge. A silence dropped over the store the way cold air drops through an open window, fast, total, and impossible to ignore. Hollow Ridge, young. Dolores repeated it slowly, as if repeating it might reveal a joke she'd missed. That's Harold's old rock pile. It's my rock pile now. Another look. Longer, this time. Dolores set down the fabric again, check. She kept setting it down. Apparently Mara kept being more interesting than yardage. Girl, there's nothing out there. 40 families tried to settle that ridge over the years, and not one of them made it through a winter. The soil's garbage, the access road washes out in a hard rain, and the only thing that's ever successfully lived out there is a family of black bears that nobody's managed to run off since… She paused, counting backward on something. 1887. What about water? Dolores blinked. What? Is there water on the ridge? There's… Dolores stopped, frowned. There's a spring somewhere, or there was. Underground, I think. I don't know if it's still running. Why does that matter if the ground won't grow anything? It matters to me, Mara said. Dolores studied her for a long moment. Then she pulled the list back across the counter and started adding up figures. The axe cost more than Mara wanted. So did the rope. She cut the blankets down to one and dropped the saw for a cheaper draw knife and tried not to let her expression change as the number climbed, because Dolores Fenn was watching her the whole time and she was not going to be watched losing her composure over arithmetic. She left the store with $13 gone and a pack so heavy it made her shoulders ache before she'd reached the end of the block. She had $4 left and a long walk ahead. 3 people tried to stop her before she got out of town. The first was Tom Ackley, who ran the livery stable and was the kind of man who gave advice freely and often to people who hadn't asked for it. He was standing outside his stable when she passed, and he looked at her pack and he said, "You headed somewhere?" "Hollow Ridge," she said. He laughed. Not meanly. That was the thing about Tom Ackley. His laughter never had any real meanness in it, which somehow made it worse. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely thinks something is too absurd to take seriously. With that pack? Alone? In what, October? November 3rd, she said. He laughed again. Lord, girl, sell the deed. You could get maybe $30 for it from somebody who doesn't know better. Take the stage to Millhaven. Find yourself a situation somewhere warm. You don't want to go out there. She smiled at him because it cost her nothing. Thank you, Mr. Ackley, she said, and kept walking. The second was a woman she didn't know by name, mid-40s, well-dressed, standing outside the milliner's with a friend. They were watching her the way women sometimes watch other women when they're deciding what story to tell about them later. As Mara passed, she caught a fragment of their lowered voices. Harold's big niece, you know the one, going out to Hollow Ridge alone, can you imagine? She won't last 2 weeks. She kept her eyes forward and her jaw level and walked through their words like walking through cobwebs. The third was Reverend Marsh, who caught her at the edge of town near the bridge and meant every single word of what he said with genuine kindness, which made it the hardest to walk away from. Miss Whitlock. He fell into step beside her, which she hadn't invited. He was a slight man, gray-haired, with the permanently worried expression of someone who carries other people's problems as a personal hobby. I heard you're heading out to the ridge. News travels fast. Callows Creek is a small town. He walked beside her for a few paces. I knew your father, you know. Briefly, good man. He would be, he chose the word carefully, concerned about you going out there alone. My father, Mara said, keeping her voice even, left me that land. I think he'd be glad I'm using it. It's not good land, Mara. Maybe it's not the land everyone thinks it is. He stopped walking. She kept going. After a moment, she heard him say behind her, quietly enough that he maybe didn't intend her to hear, God watch over her. She crossed the bridge and didn't look back. The walk to Hollow Ridge took most of the day. The road, if you could call it a road, petered out after the first 6 miles and became a track, and then the track became a suggestion, and then even the suggestion gave out somewhere around mile 9, and she was navigating by the sun and a rough description she'd gotten from Dolores, who'd been to the ridge once, years ago, with her late husband, and remembered mainly that it was far and up and not worth it. Mara's left boot had a seam that rubbed. She'd known about it for weeks and hadn't had the money to fix it. And now, 8 miles into rocky ground, it was making itself known with the persistence of a splinter you can't quite reach. Her pack pulled on her right shoulder worse than her left. Her thighs ached from the grade of the climb. At some point in the early afternoon, she sat on a boulder and ate a handful of dried beans raw because she hadn't thought to soak them, and she was hungry enough that she didn't much care. She chewed them and looked out at the country around her. It was beautiful, she'd give it that. Brutal and bare and going gold with late autumn, but beautiful. She could see maybe 20 miles to the west, ranges stacking up behind each other like curtains. She could see a hawk working a thermal so high it was almost invisible. She thought about her uncle, about the particular tone of his voice when he said, "Don't come back." Not angry, not guilty, just relieved. Like she was a problem he'd been carrying and had finally set down. She'd spent 4 years in that house trying to be useful enough to justify her presence. She'd cooked and cleaned and taken care of the younger children and never once asked for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. She'd made herself small in every way she could manage, which was its own kind of irony, and it still hadn't been enough. She'd still been too much, too heavy, too quiet, too present, taking up space that Harold Whitlock needed for something else. She picked up the bag and kept walking. She smelled the cave before she saw it. That was the first surprise. She'd expected the smell of rock and cold and maybe animal. The bears Dolores mentioned lived somewhere in her mind as an unresolved concern, but what she got instead was something she couldn't immediately name. A deep cold smell, yes, but clean. Like well water, like the inside of a stone jug on a July morning. She pushed through a stand of bare-limbed scrub oak and found the cliff face. It wasn't dramatic. She'd half expected something dramatic, some gaping dark mouth in the rock, like something out of an adventure story. What she found was a low opening, maybe 4 feet high at the tallest point, half hidden by a shelf of rock that jutted out overhead like a poorly built eave. If you didn't know to look, you'd walk right past it. You'd see cliff face and scrub and the beginnings of a talus slope, and you'd keep moving. She crouched down and looked in. Dark. A smell of cold and water and old stone. She waited for her eyes to adjust. What she saw in that first minute in the dimness was enough to make her sit down on the ground outside the entrance, which she hadn't planned to do. The cave was bigger than the opening suggested, much bigger. The ceiling rose as it went back, and the floor, while rough, was reasonably level. There was a sound she couldn't place at first, steady, low, rhythmic. It took her another minute to understand that she was hearing water, moving water. Somewhere inside the rock, water was running. She sat there for a while in the failing afternoon light. Then she got her matches out, lit a small torch she'd fashioned from a stick and a strip of cloth, and went inside to look at what she had. She didn't sleep well that first night. She built a small fire near the cave mouth for warmth and cooked the beans she'd soaked in her tin cup and ate them, sitting with her back against the stone and her blanket pulled around her shoulders, watching the fire and listening to the wind pick up outside. The wind sounded like it meant business. The kind of wind that reminds you it was there before you and will be there after. She listened to it doing its work against the cliff face and noticed, with a small satisfaction she didn't let herself celebrate too much, that inside the cave the temperature had not dropped when the wind started. The stone held heat. Or rather, it held the absence of cold, which was not the same thing, but was better than nothing. And right now, better than nothing was everything. She pulled out the photograph of her mother, held it toward the firelight. Her mother had been a small woman, small and quick and capable, the kind of woman who could look at a broken thing and immediately see how to fix it. She'd died when Mara was 13, fever, 3 days, gone before anyone fully understood how sick she was. Mara had spent the next 5 years remembering everything she'd been taught and wishing she'd paid closer attention. "You see what's there," her mother had told her once, looking at a stretch of riverbank that everyone else was walking past. "Not what you expected. What's actually there. That's the whole trick, baby. Most people never learn it." Mara looked at the cave around her. She was starting to see what was actually there. It would take work. More work than she could fully inventory yet. The roof needed a proper smoke hole, or the fire would become a problem. The water source had to be located exactly, tested, trusted, or not trusted. The entrance had to be reinforced, not just for bears, but for wind, for cold, for the possibility of snow drifting in. She'd need wood, more than she could probably gather before the first hard freeze. She'd need to think about food storage, about light, about a dozen things she hadn't thought about yet. She was exhausted. Her boot seam had drawn blood at her heel. Her shoulders would ache for days. She tucked the photograph carefully back into her coat pocket, over her heart. Most people never learn it, her mother had said. Mara looked at the 42 acres of rock and scrub she'd been handed like an apology and thought, I'm going to learn it. She banked the fire and pulled the blanket tight and closed her eyes while the wind worked its way around the cliff outside, looking for a way in and finding none. She was still awake an hour later when she heard something move outside the cave entrance. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. She lay very still. She heard breathing that wasn't hers. She reached slowly for the handle of the axe she'd set within arm's reach before lying down. The breathing stopped. After a long moment, whatever was out there moved away into the dark. She didn't sleep for another 2 hours. When she finally did, she dreamed of nothing, which was, she decided when she woke to gray dawn light, exactly the kind of sleep she'd needed. She got up, put water on to boil, and went back to work. The bear came back on the third night. Mara heard it before she saw it. That same heavy, unhurried breathing just outside the cave entrance, the sound of something large that had no reason to be in a hurry because nothing out here was going to make it one. She'd spent the 2 days since her arrival doing inventory. The cave ran back about 60 feet before the ceiling dropped too low to stand. The underground stream entered through a crack in the eastern wall about 30 feet in and ran along a shallow channel in the rock before disappearing back underground. Another 20 feet later, and the temperature inside the cave, even on the coldest part of the night, stayed well above what it was outside. She'd measured it the only way she had available, by feel, by the fact that her water didn't freeze overnight when left near the back wall, while a cup she'd left just outside the entrance had a skin of ice on it by morning. These were things she knew. The bear was something she didn't know yet, and she had a healthy respect for the things she didn't know yet. She sat up slowly, reached for the axe, and waited. The breathing moved along the entrance shelf, paused, moved again. She could see a shadow against the gray pre-dawn light where the opening was, darker than dark, shifting, big. Not curious the way a young bear is curious, deliberate. She made a decision. She picked up 2 rocks she'd placed near the fire pit for exactly this reason and cracked them together as hard as she could. The sound bounced off the stone walls and came back amplified, a sharp crack like a rifle shot. She did it again. Then she raised her voice and said loudly and clearly into the dark, "This is my cave. You can have the rest of the ridge." A long silence. Then the shadow moved away. She heard the brush crackle, once, twice, and then nothing. She sat with the rocks in her hands for another 10 minutes, heart going at a pace she'd rather not have counted. Then she set them down and stoked the fire and put water on to boil and told herself that the shaking in her hands was from the cold and knew perfectly well it wasn't. She did not let herself think about what would have happened if the rocks hadn't worked. That was a road that led nowhere useful. Instead, she thought about what she needed to do about the entrance, how to make it smaller, more defensible, without cutting off the airflow she needed for the fire. She thought about this until the water boiled, and by the time she'd drunk her cup of hot water with the last of the dried herbs she'd found in her pack, her Aunt Ruth had tucked them in without Harold knowing. She was almost sure of it. She had the rough shape of a plan. It wasn't a good plan yet, but it was a start. The trees on the lower part of the ridge were mostly scrub oak and a stand of second-growth pine that somebody had logged maybe 30 years ago and never come back to finish the job. The pines were the ones she wanted, straight-grained, manageable weight, resin-rich enough that they'd burn well and hold up against weather if she could get them shaped and stacked. The problem was that she was one person with a hand axe and a draw knife and no experience felling timber beyond what she'd seen done and what she'd read in 2 farming almanacs she'd borrowed from Harold's shelf and returned before anyone noticed. The first tree she tried to fell took her most of a morning. It was maybe a foot across at the base, not large by any measure, and she chose it because it was already leaning slightly away from its neighbors in the direction she wanted it to go. She'd read that you cut a notch on the fall side first, then a back cut on the other. She knew this. What she hadn't accounted for was the way a hand axe bites differently than a full felling axe. Shorter swing, less momentum, more repetitions, and the way her shoulders would feel after 200 repetitions of the same motion on a cold morning when she hadn't eaten anything more substantial than cornmeal mush in 3 days. The tree came down crooked. Not dangerously. It didn't snap back or twist. It just fell about 15 degrees off where she'd aimed it, into a stand of brush that slowed its fall and left it hung up for an annoyed 10 minutes while she figured out how to free it. She stood looking at the mess of branches and her badly notched stump and thought, with a weariness that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Well, that's what the first one looks like. She cut the branches off and started dragging the trunk uphill. That was worse than the felling. The trunk weighed more than she'd estimated, and the slope was steeper than it looked, and her left heel, where the boot seam had rubbed it raw, was making every step a small negotiation. She got the trunk maybe 100 yards before she had to stop, sit on it, and breathe through her nose for a while. Her hands were bleeding from a blister she hadn't noticed forming on her right palm. She wrapped it in a strip torn from the hem of her spare shirt, which was now not a spare shirt so much as a slowly diminishing source of bandage material. She looked back down the slope at the remaining trees. She looked up the slope at the cave entrance, still another 200 yards. She did the math that nobody wants to do but that needs doing. How many trees? How many trips? How many days? How many days before the first real freeze? Her calculations were rough, and her knowledge incomplete, but the answer came back the same way twice. Not enough time if you keep working this slowly. She sat for another minute. Then she got up and started back down the slope for another tree. By the end of the first week, she had 8 logs at the cave site and hands that looked like she'd been fighting something with claws. She'd developed a system, not a good system, but hers, of cutting notches in the log and threading the rope through to give herself a grip and a mechanical advantage on the steepest parts of the slope. It added time to each haul, but saved enough energy that she could make 2 trips some days instead of 1. She'd also figured out that going down on hands and knees for the worst sections was faster than trying to walk upright and slipping, which was a thing she'd learned by falling twice and had decided to figure out before she fell a third time. Her food situation was more urgent than she'd let herself fully think about in those first days, which was a luxury she couldn't keep affording. She had enough flour and beans for maybe another 2 weeks if she was careful, and careful meant 1 meal a day at the size that actually satisfied her, rather than 2 small ones that didn't. She'd found what she thought were edible roots on the lower slope. She recognized them from descriptions in the almanac, and she'd boiled them and eaten a small test portion and waited, and when she felt fine the next morning, she'd gone back for more. That was one thing. She'd also discovered that the ridge had rabbits, which was a more complicated discovery because she had no traps and no gun, and her throwing arm was accurate enough for rocks at bears apparently, but not for prey that moved faster and cared more about it. She spent an afternoon making snares from the rope, cutting it into lengths she measured by guesswork against her forearm, bending green wood into loops. The almanac had described snare making in about 4 sentences, which was the kind of helpfulness that made her want to sit down and have a brief private argument with whoever had written it. She set 6 snares in what she hoped were likely runs, and went to bed telling herself not to expect anything. She caught a rabbit on the second morning. It was the best thing she'd eaten in 10 days, and she knew, while eating it, that she was making sounds that would have embarrassed her in any company, and she didn't care at all. The cabin frame went up in pieces, badly, and then better. She'd planned it against the cliff face beside the cave entrance. Not a full cabin, she didn't have the lumber for that, but a lean-to structure that would shelter the entrance and create a windbreak that would keep the cold from pouring straight into the cave every time the temperature dropped. The first wall she built leaned wrong. She couldn't figure out why until she stood back and looked at it and saw that she'd set the base logs on uneven ground and convinced herself it didn't matter. And it did matter. She took it apart and reset the base and felt the particular frustration of doing a thing twice that you should have done right once, which is different from regular frustration in that it comes with its own commentary. The second attempt held. It wasn't square, she had no square, and her eye wasn't good enough to substitute for one. But it held, and when she packed the gaps with clay from the stream bank and dried bark, and whatever else she could find that would stop a draft, it held the cold out reasonably well. She hung a doubled wool blanket she couldn't really spare across the entrance gap, and stood inside the combined space, lean-to and cave mouth together, and felt for the first time something that was in the neighborhood of shelter. Not comfortable shelter, not warm shelter, but shelter you could defend against a serious winter, if you were careful and lucky and didn't make too many mistakes. She was 2 weeks in. She had not spoken to another person in 14 days. This bothered her less than she'd expected and more than she wanted to admit. She was accustomed to quiet. Harold's house had not been a loud or affectionate place, and she'd spent a lot of years there in a kind of self-imposed silence, keeping her thoughts to herself because sharing them hadn't ever seemed to make things better. But there was a difference between quiet around other people and quiet in an empty landscape, and she was starting to feel the second kind in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like the absence of witness. No one to see what she was doing, no one to confirm that any of it was real, that she was real, that the work she was putting in was actually adding up to something. She started talking to herself. Not conversations, nothing that elaborate, just a running low commentary on what she was doing and why. The kind of narration a person offers when they're explaining something to someone who needs things explained carefully. This notch goes here because the weight needs somewhere to sit. This clay needs to dry before I pack another layer or the whole thing will crack. This rabbit needs to be cleaned before I think about anything else because I'm hungry and I'm letting myself be distracted. It helped. She didn't fully understand why, and she didn't try to. The fireplace was the hardest thing she'd built yet. She'd known she needed it, a permanent heat source inside the cave, not just the small fire she'd been maintaining near the entrance, which ate wood faster than she could gather it and threw most of its warmth out the front where the wind could take it. What she needed was mass, stone and clay built into a shape that would absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, keeping the interior temperature stable through a long, cold night without requiring constant feeding. She knew the principle. She'd read it. Reading about it and building it turned out to have approximately the same relationship as reading about swimming and jumping into a river. Her first attempt at the firebox collapsed when she removed the temporary supports she'd built inside it, while the clay dried. The clay hadn't dried all the way through because she hadn't waited long enough because she was impatient and cold and tired, which is the combination that causes most avoidable mistakes. She sat in the rubble of it for a minute or two doing something that wasn't quite crying. Her eyes stung, and she pressed the heel of her hand against one of them and just held it there. And then she started picking up the pieces. The second attempt she built in stages, letting each section dry completely before adding the next. It took 6 days. She ran low enough on wood during those 6 days that she was sleeping in her coat and both pairs of socks and waking up in the night to check the fire temperature, which she measured by holding her hand a foot above the coals and counting seconds. 3 seconds was right, 2 was too hot. 4 meant she needed to add wood. When she finally lit a proper fire in the finished firebox and watched the smoke find the chimney channel she'd chipped into the rock above and follow it up and out without flooding the interior, when that happened, she sat on the cave floor with her arms around her knees and her face turned toward the heat rising off the new stone, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to feel real. Then she wrote a list. She'd been keeping lists on the back of the land deed envelope, which she'd been careful not to damage, writing small. The list was wood for 3 weeks, clay for chimney repair, more snares, seeds. And under seeds she'd written a question mark, because seeds were the things she didn't know how to solve yet. You couldn't grow food in November. You could barely grow food in October. But if she was going to survive here past the winter, and she was going to survive here past the winter, she had decided this without drama, as a simple fact about what was going to happen. She needed to be able to grow food when the ground permitted it, and she needed to start thinking about that now. She looked at the cave floor, at the soil, if you could call it that had been accumulating in the back section of the cave for probably decades. Leaves and debris blown in, broken down over time by darkness and moisture into something that crumbled between her fingers and smelled rich, the way good soil smells rich. She spent most of an afternoon digging her hands into it, testing it in different sections, following the underground stream's path by the moisture pattern in the soil near the eastern wall. Then she went outside and started carrying buckets of it to the back of the cave where the temperature was most stable. It wasn't a garden. Not yet. It was an idea. A rough, possibly unworkable, absolutely necessary idea. She planted it like a seed in her own mind and let it sit there. 3 weeks after she arrived at Hollow Ridge, Mara walked back into Callow's Creek. She needed 2 things she couldn't make: hens and sheep. These were not impulse purchases. She'd thought about this for days, working through the math while she dragged logs and packed clay and lay awake listening to the wind. Hens gave eggs, protein she could depend on through winter without hunting. Sheep gave wool she could learn to work, and eventually milk, and eventually offspring. They both needed to be housed and fed and kept warm, which meant she needed to expand the lean-to further than she'd planned and build proper pens inside the cave where the temperature wouldn't drop below killing cold. She had just under $4 left. She had no idea $4 was enough. She walked into town looking like what she was, a girl who'd been living rough for 3 weeks, wearing clothes that showed it, with hands that looked like she'd been in an argument with a rock face, which was more or less accurate. She walked straight to the feed store because she'd heard there was a man there who sometimes had livestock to sell. And she pushed open the door and stood for a moment while her eyes adjusted from the flat gray outdoor light to the warmer interior. There were 3 men inside, one behind the counter she didn't know, 2 leaning against the far wall who had the look of men who'd been there a while and weren't in a hurry to be somewhere else. They all looked at her. "Looking to buy hens," she said, "and at you, if the price is right." The man behind the counter, heavy-set, maybe 60, with the permanent squint of someone who spends a lot of time looking at the sky for weather, looked her up and down. "You Whitlock's niece?" "I was. Now I'm Mara Whitlock, Hollow Ridge." One of the men against the wall made a sound. She didn't look at him. The counterman leaned on the edge of his display. "My name's Garrett. What are you paying?" "What are you asking?" He told her. The hens were possible, just. The ewe would take every cent she had left and still require a negotiation she might not win. She stood there running the numbers in her head in a way she hoped didn't show on her face. "I'll give you $3.70 for 2 hens and the ewe," she said. "I know that's low. I also know you've got 3 ewes in that pen outside and they're all past good breeding age, so you're not selling them for top price anyway." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "You got a place to keep livestock?" "I do." "Out at the ridge?" "Yes." "In a cave?" "I've built shelter," she said. The man against the wall, she could feel him still without looking, made the sound again, louder this time. She turned and looked at him directly. He was maybe 45, lean and weathered, with the kind of smile that's comfortable at someone else's expense. "No offense, miss," he said, not particularly trying to make it true, "but a big girl living in a cave with 2 chickens is about the saddest thing I've heard this week." She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Garrett. $3.70, and I'll need a feed sack to carry the hens in." Garrett looked at the man against the wall, then back at her. Something in his expression shifted, not admiration, nothing as clear as that, more like an adjustment, a small recalibration of what he was dealing with. He held out his hand. She shook it. She made it back to the ridge with both hens alive, which was more than she'd been confident of an hour into the return trip when one of them started making a sound that she was reasonably certain meant it was about to die of either distress or indignation. The ewe walked beside her on a lead rope, with the resigned patience of an animal that has long since accepted that humans are going to be a permanent fact of life and has decided to endure rather than resist. She'd named the ewe before she got home. She didn't plan to. It happened somewhere on the last uphill mile when the ewe stumbled and recovered and looked at Mara with an expression of pure existential complaint. And Mara found herself saying out loud to no one, "You're fine, Ruth." And then the name stuck, which maybe said something about what she thought of her aunt. She settled the animals in the expanded intersection of the lean-to, where she'd built a pen from the straightest branches she could find, sealed at the bottom with packed clay to keep drafts off the ground. The hens went into a smaller enclosure she'd wired together with the last of the rope cut fine. Ruth stood in the center of her pen and surveyed the situation and appeared to find it approximately what she'd expected from the universe. That night, Mara sat by the fire with the animals making small sounds behind her, and something she hadn't felt in a long time settled into the space behind her ribs. Not happiness exactly, closer to purpose. The sense of a thing that was becoming rather than just surviving. She was nearly broke. She was alone. She was in a cave on a ridge that had defeated every previous attempt at habitation. Her hands were raw, her heel was still not healed, and she hadn't had a full night's sleep since she'd arrived. But the fireplace drew clean. The snares had caught 2 more rabbits. The underground garden beds had been packed with the best soil she'd found, and in 3 of them she'd pressed the few seed potatoes she'd gotten from Garrett, thrown into the deal at the last minute when she'd noticed them in a sack behind his counter and asked their price, and he'd shrugged and said, "Take them." She wasn't sure why he'd done that. She hadn't asked. She pulled out the envelope and added to her list. Potato beds, 3. Smoking rack for meat. Roof patch southwest corner. Clay cracking. Ruth, check hooves. Then she stopped writing and looked at the list for a while. Everything on it was a problem she'd created by being here, which meant everything on it was a problem she'd created by choosing to survive. She'd spent 4 years in Harold Whitlock's house trying to make herself small enough that her existence stopped being a problem for someone else. She was done with that. Every item on this list was hers. Every problem on it was one she'd chosen. She folded the envelope and put it away. Outside, the wind had picked up. It worked around the cliff face the way it always did, looking for the gap, finding the lean-to structure instead, and finding it not impermeable. Not by any means, she could feel the draft at the floor level even now. But standing, still standing, the hen settled. Ruth shifted her weight and exhaled heavily through her nose, which was apparently a sheep's way of expressing philosophical resignation. Mara banked the fire, checked the chimney draw, pulled her blanket up, and told herself she would sleep 4 hours before she needed to check the fire again. She slept 5.5, which was almost a luxury. She woke before dawn to the smell of the first real frost coming off the mountain, cold and clean and absolute. She was out of flour. She had half a bag of beans left. She had a Yue who was going to need more than dried grass through winter, hens who needed grain she hadn't budgeted for, potato beds that might not produce anything before the freeze locked the soil, and a chimney that was already showing a crack in the southwest corner that would widen in freeze-thaw cycles if she didn't pack it properly. She got up, put water on, and started thinking. The morning came in gray and serious and so cold, her breath hung in the air like smoke. She stood at the cave entrance, watching the ridge come out of darkness, and thought about the man in Garrett's store, his easy smile, his casual dismissal. She thought about Tom Ackley's laugh, about the women outside the milliner's, about Harold's voice, "Don't come back." She stayed with those thoughts for about as long as it took to feel them clearly. Then she went back inside and got to work. What nobody in Callows Creek understood, what she hadn't understood herself until she'd been here long enough to feel it, was that survival wasn't one big decision. It was 1,000 small ones, made before you were fully awake, made with sore hands and an empty stomach, made without anyone watching and without any guarantee that they were the right decisions. It was staying in motion even when the motion didn't feel like progress. It was building the fireplace twice. It was talking to a Yue named Ruth about what needed doing today. It was unglamorous and it was relentless. And she was beginning to understand exactly what she had always been built for. She did not know yet what the winter would bring. She knew it would be hard. Harder than this. Harder than she could fully imagine from here. She knew the ridge had turned back every other person who'd tried to claim it. She knew her provisions were low and her skills were incomplete, and she had maybe 12 things on her list that needed doing before the first snowfall, and not enough days to do all of them well. She rolled up her sleeves, literally, because her coat was getting in the way, and started on the chimney repair. The crack in the southwest corner was worse than she'd thought. It had spread overnight, probably from the temperature drop, and when she pressed clay into it, she could feel the stone shift slightly under her fingers, which was the kind of information she'd rather not have had, but needed. She packed it carefully, working slowly, pressing the clay deep before building up the surface layer. She worked for an hour on 6 inches of crack and thought about whether she needed to dismantle part of the chimney and rebuild it properly, and reached the conclusion she'd been trying to avoid reaching. Yes, probably. Not today. Not this week. But before the deep winter set in, she added it to the list. Across the cave, Ruth was watching her with the particular combination of curiosity and boredom that seemed to be Ruth's default setting. "I know," Mara said. "It's a lot." Ruth did not disagree. The frost on the entrance shelf had not melted by mid-morning, which told her something about how the temperature was holding. She'd been tracking it by a system she'd devised. Marks scratched into the cave wall with a nail, a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 was warm enough to work without gloves, and 1 was cold enough to see her breath inside the cave. The morning was a 3. Yesterday had been a 4. She needed to find more firewood before the next freeze cycle locked the ground, because wood that had been wet and frozen was poor burning wood, and she could not afford poor burning wood. She added firewood to the top of the list, above chimney repair, above potato beds, above everything else. Then she put the list away and went out to find it. The ridge in the gray morning light was not beautiful, the way it had been on that first afternoon, golden and distant and patient. It was working country now, stripped down to its utility, offering exactly what you came looking for and nothing else. She moved through the scrub oak with her hand axe and a rope and gathered deadfall first, always deadfall first because it was already dry, and added fresh-cut pine at the edges where she could find it, stacking it loose for now, and planning the drying rack she needed to build, so the new wood would be ready in 2 weeks rather than 6. She worked until the light started going. She ate the last of the beans that evening with a piece of roasted rabbit she'd pulled from the smoking rack. The smoking rack she'd built 3 days ago from green branches, and which was working better than she'd expected, though it needed adjusting on the south side where the smoke wasn't distributing evenly. She went to bed with the fire banked and the animals settled and the crack in the chimney freshly packed. She lay in the dark and made herself go through the list, item by item, not to worry, but to know. Knowing was different from worrying. Knowing was information. Information was how you made the next decision. She had enough to survive the next 2 weeks. She had a chimney that needed work. She had animals that needed more than she'd provided for them. She had no more money and no way to get any except by making it through to spring with enough left over to sell or trade. She also had a cave that held heat no matter what the wind outside was doing. She had an underground water source that had not dried up or frozen in the 2.5 weeks she'd been watching it. She had soil that nobody else had thought to look for, in a place nobody else had thought to look. She had potato beds that might produce something before the freeze came down. She lay there in the dark and let herself sit with both sides of the equation for a while. Not pretending one outweighed the other, just holding them both. Then she turned over, pulled the blanket up to her ear, and slept a solid 6 hours. The next morning, the first snow came. Not the real snow. Not yet. Just a dusting, enough to show her footprints between the cave and the woodpile, enough to show her the shape of the wind by how it patterned against the cliff face, enough to tell her that whatever she hadn't finished yet, the clock was now running whether she was ready or not. She stood in the entrance of the lean-to and looked at it. Then she went back inside, woke up the fire, fed Ruth, collected the first egg one of the hens had produced, small, brown, absolutely perfect, and held it in her palm for a moment before setting it carefully in the tin cup to keep it from rolling. She had been here 23 days. She was still here. The snow that came on day 23 was a warning. Mara understood that. It sat on the ground for 2 days, light enough that it didn't stop her work, heavy enough that it changed the quality of the cold, made it wetter, more penetrating, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck and settled there. She packed the remaining chimney crack with a second layer of clay mixed with sand she'd sifted from the stream bank, a combination she'd worked out by trial after the first clay layer had dried with too many small fractures. She rebuilt the south side of the smoking rack. She cut and stacked another 3 days of firewood and then looked at the stack and cut 3 more days' worth because the stack didn't look like enough, and she was learning to trust that instinct. The potato beds in the back of the cave were doing something she hadn't been sure they would do. In the stable temperature back there, away from the freeze-thaw at the entrance, the soil held a faint warmth from the earth itself. She'd noticed this in the second week, pressing her palm flat against the ground and feeling it, a geological warmth that had nothing to do with her fire and everything to do with being inside the mountain rather than on top of it. 3 of the seed potatoes she'd planted were showing small pale shoots reaching toward the light. She'd started providing from a tallow candle set on a stone shelf she'd chipped into the wall. The shoots were thin and a little desperate looking, reaching like something that badly wants to live. She found them, in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone, genuinely moving. The 4th bed showed nothing. She dug carefully around it with a stick and found the potato had gone soft and dark, rotting rather than growing. She removed it, added fresh soil from the supply she'd been building up near the stream entrance, and pressed in the last reserve potato she'd been hoarding in her coat pocket since the day Garrett had given them to her. She patted the soil back into place with both hands and told herself it would either grow or it wouldn't, and that was the only way to find out. Ruth had begun to understand that the sound of Mara getting up in the morning meant food, and had developed the habit of making a low, carrying complaint until this understanding was acted upon. The hens had settled into their routine of producing 1 egg between them every day or so, which was not a bounty, but was consistent. And consistency was what Mara was building everything on. It was during the 4th week that she first understood how close she was cutting it. She was inventorying her supplies. She did this every 4 days the same way, everything counted and listed and compared against the previous count. So she knew the rate of consumption rather than just the current amount. When she added up the numbers and saw that, at her current rate of use, she'd run out of beans before the end of December. Not short. Out. And beans were the foundation of everything, the reliable daily calories that kept her functional enough to do the work that everything else depended on. Without them, she'd be surviving on rabbit and eggs and whatever the potato beds eventually produced, which might be enough and might not be, and the uncertainty of it was the kind of thing that kept her awake, staring at the chimney in the dark. She lay there that night and thought about going back to town, about what she could trade. She had rabbit pelts. She'd been curing them carefully, scraping them clean and stretching them on frames she'd bent from green wood, and she had 9 of them now in various states of readiness. She had one hen who was producing more reliably than the other. She had time and labor to offer, which was less portable but potentially valuable to someone. She realized, more than she'd had when she walked into Garrett's store with $4 and a plan. She lay with that thought for a while. It was a small thing, but it was a real thing. She went back to Callow's Creek on a Thursday, carrying 7 of the best cured pelts rolled and tied with rope. The morning was hard cold, the sky the particular shade of white that means weather is deciding something. She made it to town in 3 hours, which was faster than her first trip, because she knew the route now and had figured out which sections of the old track were safe to move quickly on and which ones had enough ice in the mud to require attention. Dolores Fenn was unlocking the general store when Mara came up the main street. Dolores looked at her, then at the roll of pelts under her arm, and held the door open without being asked. "You're still alive," Dolores said. Not unkindly, more like someone checking on a calculation they weren't sure about. "Still alive," Mara agreed. Inside, Dolores looked at the pelts with the professional attention of someone who had been taking inventory of things her whole life. She unrolled 2 of them, checked the scraping, checked the stretch, held one up to the window light. "These are decent," she said, which from Dolores Fenn appeared to be high praise. "I know they're not perfect. The 2 at the bottom I did earlier, and the technique was worse. I can see that." Dolores set the pelts on the counter. "What do you want for them?" "Dried corn, whatever equivalent you think is fair." Dolores studied her. "You're short on provisions." "I'm managing provisions. There's a difference." "There is," Dolores agreed. She went to the back of the store and came back with a quantity of dried corn that Mara measured with her eyes and thought was probably slightly generous. She didn't say so. "People have been asking about you," Dolores said, wrapping the corn. "What kind of asking?" "The kind where they expect to hear you've come back with your tail between your legs." Dolores tied the paper package. "Some of them have a bet on when you'll give up." Mara took the package. "What did you bet?" Dolores gave her a look that was difficult to read. "I didn't bet. I don't gamble on people." She paused. "I will say I told Garrett that if you made it to December with the animals alive, I'd revise my opinion." "It's November 21st, Mara said. "I know what day it is." Mara picked up the corn and the remaining pelts Dolores hadn't taken. "I'll be back before Christmas," she said. "I'll have more." She was halfway out of the door when Dolores said behind her, "Girl, be careful going back. There's a storm system coming out of the north. Trappers have been reporting it for 4 days. Could be bad." Mara stood in the doorway for a moment. "How bad?" "The kind of bad that has a name after it's done," Dolores said. "Usually." She walked home faster than she'd walked anywhere since she arrived on the ridge. She spent the next 6 days in a kind of controlled emergency that she would not let herself call panic, because panic was what happened when you stopped thinking clearly, and she could not afford to stop thinking clearly. She cut wood until her shoulders sent up a formal complaint she had to acknowledge by stopping for half an hour, and then she cut more wood. She packed every gap in the lean-to she could find with clay and bark, and a quantity of pine resin she'd been collecting in a tin, and which was sticky and difficult and effective. She deepened the snow channel she'd dug outside the entrance so that drifting snow would pile there rather than against the door. She brought the firewood inside the lean-to section, stacking it along the inner wall where it would stay dry. She checked every joint in Ruth's pen and the hen enclosure and repacked the loose ones. She moved her water collection system, the series of flat stones she'd positioned to direct underground seepage into the clay-lined hollow she used as a cistern, and extended it 3 feet to catch a secondary seep she'd identified in the east wall but hadn't bothered connecting before. She was not ready. She knew she wasn't ready. She wasn't sure ready was something you could actually achieve or just something you approximated and then hoped. On the evening of the 6th day, she sat by the fire and looked at what she had. Firewood for, she estimated conservatively, 3 weeks of sustained burning. Dried beans and corn for slightly longer than that if she was careful. Rabbit in the smoker, 2 carcasses, which she'd eat in order of spoilage risk. eggs coming in at roughly one per day. The potato beds showing continued growth. The new planting had sprouted, pale but real, and two of the original three had put out secondary shoots. Water from the underground source, reliable and constant, unaffected by surface temperature. Ruth, healthy, eating the dried grass Mara had gathered and stacked inside in quantities that had seemed excessive 3 weeks ago and now seemed like they might be exactly right. She thought about what Dolores had said, the kind of bad that has a name after it's done. She banked the fire carefully, deeper than usual, built up on both sides with the larger pieces that would burn slow, and checked the chimney draw one more time with a piece of paper she held near the opening. The paper moved steadily toward the chimney. Good draw, good seal. She lay down and listened to the mountain around her. In the back of the cave, she could hear the underground stream. It was constant. It had been constant since the night she arrived, through freezes and thaws and the full range of surface weather. Whatever was happening above ground, the water down here didn't know about it or care. That sound, that steady low movement of water through stone, had become the closest thing to a heartbeat the ridge had, the proof that the place was alive in some way that had nothing to do with her presence. She pressed her hand flat against the cave floor and felt the faint geological warmth she'd noticed before. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing. She knew, from the almanac she'd spent a week reading until she nearly had it memorized, that this was often what happened before a serious storm. The air got very still. It was the stillness of something gathering itself. She got up one more time and added a log to the fire. Then she went back to her blanket and closed her eyes and told herself, with a firmness that was maybe more necessary than she wanted to admit, "You built this for exactly this." The blizzard arrived before dawn on a Saturday. She woke to a sound she'd never heard before. Not wind exactly, or not wind the way she'd always understood it. This was wind as a structural event, wind that was doing something to the landscape rather than moving through it. It hit the cliff face with a force she felt in the stone under her, a low, sustained pressure that was more vibration than sound. She sat up and looked at the entrance and saw nothing unusual except that the temperature in the lean-to section had dropped visibly. She could see it in the fire behavior, the way the flame pressed sideways for a moment before the chimney draw corrected it. She added 2 logs. Checked the animals. Ruth was standing, which was a good sign. A sheep lying flat in bad weather was a sheep that had stopped fighting it, and she didn't want Ruth to stop fighting anything. The hens were pressed together in their enclosure, feathers fluffed, still alive. She made herself eat breakfast before she did anything else. This was a discipline she'd developed early and maintained because she'd learned that everything she did, every decision she made, was better when she'd eaten than when she hadn't. It wasn't a luxury. It was operational. She ate a portion of bean and corn mash she'd prepared the night before, still warm from the covered pot she kept near the fire. She ate the egg from the previous evening, hard-boiled. She drank 2 cups of hot water. Then she did a full inventory check by feel and firelight, working through each item on her list with her hands as much as her eyes. Everything where she'd put it, everything accounted for. She sat back and took stock. The storm sounded enormous. She'd been in hard weather before. Winters in Harold's house, drafty and poorly heated, had required their own kinds of management. But this was different. This was weather that didn't distinguish between structures, that applied itself equally to everything above ground and expected everything above ground to deal with it or fail to. She could hear trees going somewhere below the ridge, not the crack of individual trees, but a deeper sound, a collective stress. The lean-to shuddered twice in the first hour, not enough to threaten it, but enough to remind her that she'd built it in November with no prior construction experience, and there were limits to what optimism and clay could accomplish. The second shudder, around mid-morning, knocked a section of her packed bark insulation from the upper corner of the lean-to wall. Cold air found the gap immediately. She was up before the bark had finished falling, pulling the spare wool shirt she'd been using as a packing material from her bag, and pressing it into the gap, holding it with one hand while she used the other to press clay over it from the supplies she always kept near the fire in a covered pot so it wouldn't dry out. Her hands were cold enough that her fingers weren't fully cooperative, but she pressed and held and waited, and after 5 minutes the clay had set enough to hold without her hands. She stepped back and looked at the repair. It would hold for now. It would need real attention when the storm passed. She added it to the list. On the second day of the storm, she ran a calculation that she didn't want to run. and ran it anyway, because not knowing didn't make the situation different. It just made her less prepared for it. She estimated the wood consumption at current burn rate against the duration of the storm. She had no way to know duration, so she used the worst estimate she thought was realistic, which was 5 days, because the almanac mentioned that the major blizzards of the previous 2 decades had averaged 4 to 5 days in duration for this elevation in region. At 5 days, and at the burn rate she was currently running to keep the animals warm enough to survive, she'd be through her wood supply in 4.5, half a day short. She sat with that number for about 10 minutes, which was as long as she was going to allow herself to sit with any single problem before she started working on it. Then she looked around the cave for what she had that would burn. She had the dead pine branches she'd collected but not yet processed, stacked in the far corner behind Ruth's pen. She'd been letting them dry further before burning them because green wood burned poorly, and she hadn't needed to compromise on quality. She needed to compromise now. She pulled them out, selected the driest looking, and broke them across her knee into manageable pieces, a process that her body objected to loudly by the third branch, and that she continued regardless. Green wood would burn if the draft was good and the fire was established. Her draft was good. Her fire was established. She supplemented the stack with 2 things she'd been keeping in reserve: the packing crates she'd found in the old logging debris on the lower slope in her first week, dry, old, and she'd kept them because she wasn't sure what for, and now she knew. And the draw knife handle, which was cracked and nearly useless, and which she'd been meaning to replace. She kept the blade. She burned the handle. This was not efficient. It was not the smooth operation of a well-stocked homestead. It was improvisation under pressure, which she'd discovered was its own particular skill, one that didn't look impressive from the outside, but was the difference between making it and not making it more often than anyone who hadn't done it would understand. She managed the fire through the second night with the careful attention of someone who is aware that the margin is narrow, and who does not let that awareness become the thing that breaks her concentration. It was near the end of the second day when she heard the knocking. She thought at first it was the storm doing something to the lean-to structure, a branch come down somewhere and striking the outer wall, or a section of the cliff face releasing something under the pressure of ice expansion. She stayed where she was and listened, trying to separate the sound from the background roar of the wind. It came again. Not a branch? Not the cliff. Someone was hitting the entrance with something. She sat for a moment that was longer than it should have been, because the rational part of her mind was presenting a perfectly sensible case for not opening the entrance in the middle of a blizzard to something of unknown origin, while another part of her was already moving, because whoever was on the other side of that door was either in serious trouble or she was hearing things, and she needed to know which. She pulled aside the doubled blanket she kept over the entrance gap, and pushed back the pine branch brace and looked out into the white. A man was crumpled against the outer wall of the lean-to, in the narrow strip of relative shelter that the overhanging rock shelf created. He was wearing a heavy trapping coat that was so covered in ice and snow it had stopped looking like a coat and started looking like a natural feature of the cliff face. He had one hand raised, the hand he'd been knocking with, and when the gap opened and light came out, he turned his face toward it with the slow, effortful movement of someone whose coordination was going. She recognized him. Not his name. She'd never learned his name, but his face. Lean, weathered, the easy smile she remembered from Garrett's store. The man who'd called her a big girl living in a cave and found it the funniest thing he'd heard that week. The smile was gone. What was left was a man who had maybe an hour of functional consciousness remaining and possibly less. "Get in," she said. He didn't argue. He couldn't, she thought. Arguing required energy he'd already spent. He got through the entrance on his hands and one knee, the other leg moving wrongly, and she got the blanket back in place, and the brace reset and turned to look at what she'd let in. How was big, bigger than her, heavier, which she registered with a practical part of her mind that was already calculating what the next 2 hours needed to look like. He was in the first stages of hypothermia going toward the second, she thought, based on what she'd read, though she'd never seen it and the reading had been purely precautionary. He was shivering badly, but still shivering, which the almanac said was better than not shivering. "Can you hear me?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes were tracking, but slow. "Yeah," he said. The word came out thick. "What's your name?" "Cale." A pause. "Cale Denton." "All right, Cale Denton. I'm going to get your coat off. I need you to help if you can." He helped. Not much, but enough. She got the outer coat off him. It hit the ground with a weight that told her it had absorbed a significant percentage of the storm, and she felt the inner layer and found it wet through. She had one dry wool blanket she'd been keeping in the warmest part of the cave for exactly the hypothetical she'd spent 10 minutes arguing herself out of taking seriously. She got him out of the wet layer with the particular combination of impatience and care that the situation required, which was not gentle but was not rough either, and wrapped the dry blanket around him and pushed him as close to the fire as she dared. "Don't fall asleep," she said. I know you're not trying to. Don't, anyway." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, part confusion, part something else, something that might have been the beginning of understanding what situation he was actually in. "You're the girl from—" "Yes," she said. "I'm the girl from the cave. Drink this." She handed him the tin cup with hot water she'd already had ready because she kept hot water ready, always, because she'd learned early that hot water was the cheapest resource she had and the most reliable. He drank it without comment. His hands around the cup shook badly at first, and then less badly as the minutes passed. She sat across the fire from him and watched him and said nothing. After maybe 20 minutes, the shivering had reduced to something more manageable, and his eyes were sharper. "My horse went down," he said, "out on the lower track. Couldn't get it up again. I knew the ridge was here. I didn't know—" He stopped. "You didn't know if I'd still be here," she said. He met her eyes. "I didn't know if anyone would be here." She chose to take that version of it. "There's someone here," she said. She gave him a portion of the bean and corn mash and watched him eat it with the focused attention of someone whose body has moved past hunger into something more urgent. He ate everything she gave him without speaking, which she appreciated. She had questions she needed answers to, about the storm, about conditions on the lower slope, about whether he'd passed anyone else on the track. But she gave him 20 more minutes before she asked any of them. "How long have you been out in it?" she said. "Since yesterday morning." He looked at the fire. "I was working trap lines on the north face. Thought I could beat the storm back to town. You can probably figure out how that went." "Were you alone?" "Had a partner, early on. We split at the ridge junction. He went south, better track. I don't know if he made it in." He looked at her steadily. "There's something else. Before the storm came fully down, I passed Holloway's wagon. You know Holloway?" She didn't. "No." "The crossing road." She knew roughly where it was. She'd seen it on the survey map she'd studied before leaving town the first time. An optimistic line that ran across the lowest part of the ridge before descending toward the eastern valley. She'd estimated it at maybe 1.5 miles from the cave entrance. In current conditions, with visibility what it was, 1.5 miles was not 1.5 miles. "When did you see them?" she said. "Maybe 3 hours before I got here, maybe 4. He looked at her carefully. "If they're still with the wagon, they'll be—" "I know," she said. She sat with it for exactly the time it took to feel it clearly. Then she got up and started looking at what she had. Her heavy coat, her rope, the axe, her boots, which she'd been drying by the fire and which were not fully dry, but were close enough. She had a second length of rope she'd made from braided bark strips. Experimental, she wasn't fully confident of its strength, but it would serve as a guideline if she anchored it at the cave and played it out as she moved. She pulled the bark strip rope from the wall where it hung and began checking it, running it through her hands foot by foot, looking for weak points. "What are you doing?" Cale Denton said. "What I have to." "You can't go out in that." He said it with conviction, not as a statement about her specifically, but as a statement about the weather, about what the weather permitted. I came in from it. You saw what I looked like." "You'd been out in it for most of a day," she said. 1.5 miles, moving with the wind, rope anchor, back here." She kept checking the rope. "It's possible." "Possible isn't— I know it's not the same as likely." She looked at him. "Is there any chance they found shelter? Anywhere on that road before you saw them?" He thought about it with genuine effort. "There's a rock formation, north side of the road. Maybe a 1/4 mile past where I saw the wagon." He shook his head. "But they'd have to know to look. And the visibility was already gone by the time I passed them." Mara checked the last section of the bark rope and found the weak point she'd been worried about, a section where 2 strands had frayed against each other. She cut it out and tied the ends with a knot her father had showed her once, a bend that lost less strength in the rope than most. The rope was now about 8 feet shorter, still long enough. "Stay by the fire," she said. "Feed it every—" She looked at her wood supply and did arithmetic she didn't like. Every 40 minutes, not more. The stack on the left is the green wood. Burn that after the regular wood is half down. Do not burn the stuff in the corner by the potato beds. That's drying and it's not ready. Cale Denton was looking at her with an expression she didn't have time to analyze. There's water in the pot, she said. Don't eat anything. I have portions counted and I need to know what's here when I get back. She was pulling on her coat while she said it. Wait, he said. She waited. He struggled upright. She saw the leg issue again. Something wrong with the right knee. He got upright, but it cost him, and looked at her from across the fire. He was a head taller than her and probably 70 pounds heavier, a man who trapped alone through high country winters and survived it. And right now he was looking at her the way someone looks at something they underestimated so substantially that the recalibration requires a moment to complete. Why? He said. It wasn't an argument. It was a real question. She thought about it. Because they're out there and I'm not, she said. And I built this place well enough that it doesn't need me for a few hours. She tied the rope to the anchor ring she'd sunk into the cave wall. She'd installed it in her third week, one of the many precautions she'd taken against possibilities she hoped wouldn't happen, paid out a few feet of slack, and went through the entrance into the white. The cold hit her with a physical force she'd been prepared for intellectually, and that still managed to surprise her. It wasn't just temperature. It was the wind behind the temperature, the mechanical force of it, pressing against her from every direction simultaneously and finding new gaps each time she thought she'd closed the last one. She pushed through the entrance drift. Snow had piled against the base of the lean-to in her last hour inside, 2 feet of it against the outer wall, and got her bearings from the cliff face at her back, which was the only fixed point she had. She could see approximately 6 feet in front of her. She played out the rope behind her and started moving. The crossing road was downslope and northeast. She'd memorized the terrain well enough that she could navigate it without landmarks under normal conditions. These were not normal conditions, and she had to rebuild her map in her head with each step, matching what her feet felt to what she remembered. The slope angle, the rock outcrops she'd learned to avoid, the section where the old track surface was harder underfoot than the surrounding ground. She fell twice in the first quarter mile. Not bad falls. She went down and got back up and kept moving, rope paying out steadily behind her, the cave somewhere back in the white that had swallowed it the moment she moved far enough away. She thought briefly about the bear she'd faced in her third night, the rocks in her hands. This is my cave. You can have the rest of the ridge. This, she thought, was the rest of the ridge. She found the wagon before she heard it, which was backwards from what she'd expected. She nearly walked into the left wheel in the whiteout, catching it with her outstretched hand and stopping just before she'd have gone down over the tongue. The horse was gone. The traces were cut or broken. She couldn't tell which, and she didn't stop to examine them. She moved around the wagon calling out. The wind ate her voice immediately. She cupped her hands around her mouth and tried again, louder, lower pitch, because lower traveled better. The answer came from the rock formation Cale had mentioned, slightly to her north, muffled but real, a voice calling back. 2 voices, she thought, both alive. She followed the sound. Edwin Holloway was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had managed to get his wife and himself into the lee of the rock formation and build a windbreak from their wagon canvas, which was a genuinely impressive piece of improvisation that had probably kept them alive through the last 3 hours. His wife, Clara, was conscious but moving poorly. Her hands were the problem, fingers that hadn't been properly protected, white at the tips in a way that Mara had read about and didn't like seeing. "Can you walk?" Mara said to Clara. Clara looked at her hands. "I think so." "You need to hold on to me with your arm, not your hands. Put your arms around my arm." She looked at Edwin. "Can you follow with your hand on my shoulder?" Edwin Holloway looked at her. He looked at the rope in her hands, the other end disappearing into the white, and then he looked at the cave entrance that end was presumably attached to, and it seemed to be the first moment he'd processed that someone had come out of this storm with a rope anchored to somewhere specific. "Who are you?" he said. "Mara Whitlock," she said. "Hollow Ridge. Now can you follow with your hand on my shoulder?" He put his hand on her shoulder without another word. She followed the rope back. It was worse going back than going out, because she was breaking trail against the wind instead of moving with it, and because she had 2 extra people whose weight and uncertainty were a factor she had to constantly compensate for. Clara stumbled twice and Mara caught her twice, which was its own negotiation with gravity that she won both times by margins she preferred not to think about too closely. Edwin kept his hand on her shoulder the entire way with a grip that was going to leave marks. And she didn't say anything about it because the grip meant he was there, and she needed to know he was there. She found the cave entrance by the feel of the cliff face changing under her free hand, the particular angle of the overhang she'd memorized by feel weeks ago. She got them through the entrance, reset the brace, pulled the blanket into place. Inside, the fire was burning. Cale Denton had fed it at some point in the last hour. He'd used regular wood, not the green wood, which she approved of. And he was sitting up against the cave wall watching the entrance with an expression of concentrated attention that shifted into something else entirely when 3 people came through it instead of 1. The cave was warmer than it had been when she left. That was the first thing she noticed. Her own fire, built up by someone else's hand, holding against the storm. Clara Holloway sat down on the floor near the fire and held her hands out toward it and made a sound that wasn't words. Edwin stood in the middle of the cave space and turned slowly, looking at the stone around him. The fireplace, the water channel, the potato beds along the back wall, the hen enclosure with its 2 occupants blinking irritably at the intrusion, Ruth in her pen regarding the newcomers with the dignified suspicion of someone whose routine has been disrupted. He turned all the way around and came back to Mara. She was hanging her wet coat on the peg she'd driven into the wall for exactly this, and removing her outer boots, which were wet through. Her hands were shaking now that she'd stopped moving. Not from cold exactly, more from the release of something she'd been holding very tightly for the last hour and a half. "You built this?" Edwin Holloway said. She looked at him. "Yes." He looked around again, slower this time, at the chimney drawing clean, at the water system, at the food stored in the careful arrangement she'd developed over weeks of iteration, at the potato beds with their small pale shoots reaching toward the tallow candlelight, at the wool blanket hanging dry by the fire that she'd handed to Cale Denton hours ago and that she was now, she realized, not going to have access to for the foreseeable future. "By yourself," Edwin said. "Yes," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, "I know this ridge. Everyone knows this ridge." He stopped. "Nobody's ever made it work out here." Mara pressed her wet socks against the warm stone near the firebox base and thought about everything she'd done to make this place what it was. The fireplace rebuilt twice, the chimney packed in stages, the potato beds in soil nobody else had bothered to look for, the water system, the wood, the rope she'd just used to bring 2 strangers out of a storm. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said. It was true. It was also not the whole truth, but it was the part of the truth that mattered to her right now. Clara Holloway was looking at her fingers, flexing them cautiously, watching the color return. Outside, the blizzard was doing its full work. The sound of it had changed as she'd come inside, deepened somehow, the way serious things deepen when they get fully started. The lean-to was shuddering in intervals but holding. The fire burned clean. The underground stream kept its steady voice in the rock. Mara got up and checked the wood supply, counted what was left, looked at the 4 people in the cave, and recalculated the burn rate. She'd need to ration more carefully. She'd need to cut the portions smaller. She'd need to think about everything she'd carefully arranged for 1 person and rebuild the arithmetic for 4. She picked up the list envelope and turned it over and started writing. The first thing Mara did after she got everyone settled was count what she had left. She did it quietly, by firelight, while Edwin sat with his arm around Clara and Cale Denton, watched the cave entrance with the focused attention of a man who had recently been reminded that the outside world could kill him. She went through every item the way she always did, methodical, without rushing, because rushing produced errors, and errors in this situation had a cost she couldn't absorb. Beans, corn, the smoked rabbit, the eggs that would keep coming one at a time from the hens, the potatoes still growing in the back beds, Ruth's dried grass supply, the wood. The wood was the number she came back to twice. 4 people burned through warmth differently than 1. The cave's natural insulation helped. She'd come to trust it, the way the stone held temperature against the surface cold in a way no built structure she'd ever been in could match. But 4 bodies and a sustained blizzard were a different calculation than 1 body and an ordinary winter night. She'd need to burn more to keep Clara's hands safe, because the color had come back into 3 fingers fully, and the 4th was still pale in a way she was watching without saying much about. She moved the wood management to the top of the list and rewrote the rationing margins at the bottom. "What are you writing?" Edwin Holloway said. He'd been watching her for a few minutes. Supply inventory, she said, without looking up. Adjusted for 4. A pause. Can I see? She looked up at that. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on a man's face directed at her in a long time. Not the calculating look of someone assessing her usefulness. Not the dismissive kind she'd gotten in Garrett's store. Something more straightforward than either. She handed him the envelope. He read it, not quickly. He moved through each item on the list with the careful attention of someone who understood what they were looking at, and she revised her estimate of him slightly upward. He'd said merchant. She hadn't asked what kind. The 4th finger on Clara's right hand, he said, without looking up from the list. I know, she said. Is it? He stopped, chose a different approach. What do you know about frostbite? Enough to be concerned and not enough to be certain, she said. Keep it warm, don't rub it, watch the color. If it goes from pale to dark, that's a different problem. She paused. She needs to move the finger every hour or so, not hard, just enough to know it still moves. He handed the envelope back. All right. He looked at Clara, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder with the abruptness of someone whose body had decided the emergency was over and acted accordingly. She's going to sleep. Let her. She needs it more than she needs to move her finger right now. I'll wake her in an hour. He nodded. He didn't say thank you, which she noted. Not because it bothered her, it didn't particularly, but because it told her something. The kind of man who says thank you in the first hour is performing gratitude. The kind who says it later, or not at all, is usually actually feeling it. Cale Denton had shifted position while she and Edwin talked, moving from the wall to a spot closer to the fire that was also, she noticed, a spot that gave him a clear line to the entrance. Trapper's instinct. She didn't say anything about it. Your knee, she said instead. He looked at it. It's been worse. That's not an answer. He almost smiled. Twisted it when my horse went down. Not broken. I've broken things before. I know what that feels like. This is just damage. Then you walk on it tomorrow if you need to? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Probably yes. Not well and not fast. All right. She looked at the entrance and listened to what the storm was doing. It had been constant for going on 30 hours now, maintaining a sustained fury that she'd stopped expecting to peak because it seemed to have no peak, just a plateau it had reached and was content to hold indefinitely. It'll be at least another day before I'd consider moving anyone anyway. Edwin shifted carefully so as not to wake Clara. You've been tracking it. As best I can from in here. The sound changes when the worst of it eases. I've learned the difference over the last month. She added a log to the fire. This hasn't eased. No, Edwin agreed. It hasn't. The second night with 4 people in the cave was harder than the first in ways that had nothing to do with supplies or firewood. It was people. Just the proximity of them, the adjustments required, the way she'd grown so accustomed to her own solitude that having bodies in her space felt like a rearrangement of something she'd carefully organized. She didn't dislike them, exactly. Cale Denton was quieter than she'd expected from the man in Garrett's store. And the quiet had a different quality to it than the easy confidence quiet of someone who doesn't need to say much because they're comfortable. This was the quiet of a man who'd had a very recent and specific education about the limits of what he'd assumed he knew. She found she didn't mind it. Edwin Holloway was harder to read. He asked questions, careful ones, about the cave and how she'd found it, and what she'd done first and what she'd done second. And he listened to the answers with a quality of attention she wasn't accustomed to from men of his apparent standing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't finish her sentences. He waited until she was done and then asked the next question. Clara woke after her hour and moved her fingers and reported that the 4th one had some feeling in it, which was the update Mara had been waiting for. And then Clara looked around the cave for the first time with the eyes of someone who was now fully awake and present rather than simply surviving, and what she saw seemed to take a moment to process. You planted those in the winter, she said, looking at the potato beds. Late November, Mara said. Soil's warmer back there. Underground heat. Clara looked at the water channel, at the chicken enclosure, at Ruth, who had spent most of the last 2 days performing a state of patient contempt for the entire situation. How long have you been here? About 7 weeks. Clara looked at her. She was maybe 50, with a round face and good eyes and the manner of someone who'd spent her life looking at things directly. Alone? Yes. The whole time? Yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, not to Edwin particularly, but not to him either. Edwin, look at what she's done. I've been looking, Edwin said. The storm eased sometime in the early hours of the third morning. Mara heard it before she could confirm it. The quality of sound outside changed, the sustained pressure dropping from a roar to something lower and intermittent, the wind finding gaps instead of filling them all simultaneously. She lay listening to it for 10 minutes to make sure she wasn't imagining the change, and then she got up and added wood to the fire and checked the temperature at the entrance. Not warm, not anywhere near warm, but the mechanical fury had passed into something you could, with preparation and care, actually move through. She let everyone sleep another 2 hours. She used the time to check the lean-to structure in the pre-dawn gray, crawling through the entrance and around the exterior with her hands running along every joint and connection she'd built, assessing the storm damage. 3 bark insulation sections had blown out and needed replacement. 1 support log had shifted, not critically, but enough that she pulled it back into position and repacked the clay around its base. The drainage channel she'd cut in the ground outside the entrance had done its job. The entrance itself was snow-packed but not drifted over, which meant the overhang had worked the way she'd designed it to work. She stood in the post-storm silence and looked out at the ridge. Everything was white and clean and featureless in the early light. Every tree and rock and fold of ground smoothed under the same continuous surface. The destruction was underneath it. She knew the trees she'd heard going on the first night were down somewhere below. But from here it just looked new, like something just made. She went back inside. Cale Denton was awake. "It stopped," he said. "Mostly." She pulled off her outer boots and knocked the snow from them. "Another day before the drifts consolidate. I wouldn't try the lower track until tomorrow at the earliest." He looked at his knee. "I can make it today if I have to." "You don't have to." He looked at her for a moment. "The Holloways have people who'll be worried." "I know, they stay until tomorrow." She said it without apology. One more night isn't going to change what people in town know, and trying that slope today with a compromised knee and 2 people who are still recovering from exposure changes what happens when you reach the bottom. He didn't argue. She thought he probably wasn't a man who argued when the logic was solid. Edwin was awake a half hour later, and Clara an hour after that. Mara rationed breakfast carefully, smaller portions than she'd have given herself alone, which meant portions that felt insufficient without being actually dangerous. A distinction she understood and couldn't fully explain to people who hadn't thought through what dangerous actually meant in this context. She gave everyone hot water first. She gave the hens their morning grain. She checked Ruth's water and feed and the potato beds, which were continuing their slow, pale insistence on existing. "The potatoes are actually growing," Clara said, crouching at the edge of the first bed. She was speaking to herself more than to anyone else, in the tone of someone watching something improbable occur. "Slowly," Mara said. "The cold slows them, but the temperature back there doesn't drop below what the soil holds, so they keep going." "What temperature is it back there?" "I don't have a thermometer. Warm enough that my water doesn't freeze and cold enough that I do." She paused. "Maybe 40 degrees. Maybe a little above." Clara stood up carefully, favoring her right hand. "And you thought of this yourself?" It wasn't quite a question. Mara answered it anyway. "I had a piece of land with bad surface soil and a cave with accumulated organic material in the back section. I put the 2 together." "You made a winter garden inside a mountain," Clara said. "It's 3 potato beds and some hope," Mara said. "Ask me in March how it went." But Clara was still looking at the beds with an expression Mara didn't fully know what to do with. It wasn't the polite interest of someone being courteous. It was genuine, focused attention on a thing they hadn't expected and couldn't quite fit into the categories they already had. Edwin came to stand beside Clara, looked at what she was looking at. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I've been selling supplies to homesteaders on this frontier for 11 years, he said. "I've seen every kind of operation people try. Sod houses, timber frames, dugouts. The ones who give up in September and the ones who make it through to February and lose everything in March." He stopped. "I have never seen anything like this." Mara waited. "What you've built here," he said, "is not what I thought it was when Cale told me about it. What I thought—" He paused, with the honesty of a man choosing not to soften something for the sake of comfort. "I thought it was a young woman in over her head, living in a hole in a rock, and I expected to hear by spring that she'd come back to town or we'd find her in the thaw." The fire crackled. Outside, the post-storm silence had that particular weight that only comes after something very loud, has stopped. And now? Mara said. Edwin looked at the cave around them, at the fireplace that drew clean, at the water system, at the stored provisions arranged with an economy of space that spoke of someone who'd thought hard about every cubic foot, at the hen enclosure that had kept 2 birds alive through a blizzard, at Ruth, who was watching him with her usual expression of dignified neutrality. Now, he said, I'm standing in the most functional survival structure I've ever seen, and I was almost dead 8 hours ago, and the person who built it is 18 years old and came here with $17. He looked at her directly. I owe you an apology. Several, I think, but I'll start with the one for what I thought before I knew what to think. Mara looked at him steadily. She'd imagined this moment before, in the way you imagine things during the long hours of repetitive physical work, when your mind needs somewhere to go. She'd imagined something like satisfaction, maybe. Something like vindication, the clean feeling of being proved right. What she actually felt was more complicated and less satisfying than either of those. She felt tired, mostly. She felt the weight of 7 weeks of work that had not been done for anyone else's benefit, and the particular flatness that comes when the thing you built stops being invisible to other people and starts being something they want to discuss. It's not finished, she said. Edwin blinked. What? This, she gestured. It's not finished. The chimney needs another rebuild before deep winter is done with it. The lean-to roof will need resealing in the spring thaw. The potato beds are an experiment, and I don't know yet if the yield will be enough to make the difference I need it to make. I have 2 hens and 1 sheep, and not enough grain to winter them comfortably at current consumption if the snow stays another 3 weeks. She looked at him. I appreciate the apology. I do. But what you're seeing is not a success. It's a work in progress that is still very much in progress. Edwin was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not down, not reassessment in the reducing direction, but up. The way a person's estimation of something goes up when they encounter honesty from a source where they expected performance. What do you need? He said. I'm sorry? What do you need that you don't have, specifically? She looked at him for a long moment, checking for something she didn't find. Condescension, the particular kind of help that is really a form of control, and not finding it. She found instead a man who sold supplies for a living and was looking at a list of needs with the focused attention of his profession. Grain, she said, enough to winter the hens and the sheep without running short. I have pelts to trade, and I can work off the difference if the value doesn't cover it. She paused. A proper thermometer, if there's any chance of it. And seed. Not immediately, but I need to know what's available for spring planting, because the surface soil is poor, but I've been amending the beds back here, and I think by April, they'll take something. Edwin pulled out a small notebook and a stub of pencil. He wrote while she talked. She hadn't expected that. She stopped speaking for a moment, surprised. Go on, he said, without looking up. She went on. But the day they spent waiting for conditions to improve was the strangest day Mara had spent at Hollow Ridge, stranger even than her first week, because it was the first time the cave held people who were awake and present and not in immediate crisis. And she had to figure out what that meant for how she occupied her own space. Cale Denton solved part of the problem by asking if he could help with anything useful, and she put him to work packing the blown-out bark insulation sections from the inside, guiding his hands to the right gaps and showing him the technique she'd developed for pressing the material so it stayed. He was good with his hands, which she'd expected from a trapper, and he worked without needing to be told things twice, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. His knee was worse than he'd said, she noted. He moved around it rather than on it, redistributing weight with the practiced unconscious compensation of someone who'd been managing an injury long enough that the adaptation had become habit. She didn't say anything about it. He told her it wasn't broken, and she believed him, and beyond that it was his business. They worked in companionable silence for most of an hour. Then he said, without particular preamble, I shouldn't have said what I said in Garrett's store. She kept pressing bark into the gap she was working on. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway. He adjusted his position to spare the knee. The big girl living in a cave comment. It was a cheap thing to say. She pressed the last of the bark section into place and held it while the clay set. It didn't change what I did, she said. It didn't change whether I came here or what I built. No, he said. That's sort of the point I'm making. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall, at the work he'd just done, with an expression that was doing several things at once. She thought he was a man who had lived his life operating on a set of assumptions about what people were capable of, sorted by categories he hadn't examined very closely, and that the last 3 days had been an uncomfortable education in what his categories had missed. "The thing is," he said, "I've been out here 6 winters. I know this ridge. I know every homestead that tried and failed on it." He finally looked at her. "I know exactly what it takes to make it through one season up here, and I've watched men with draft horses and full supply wagons and experienced hands not make it. And you—" He stopped. "You did all of this." "I'm not through the season yet," she said. "You're going to be," he said. She didn't answer. She started on the next gap. Clara Holloway found the photograph. It fell from the pocket of Mara's coat when she was hanging it to dry after the brief period she'd been outside checking the drift patterns. And Clara, who was closest, picked it up before Mara could reach it. She held it for a moment, looking at it. The image of a small, quick woman with something in her expression that was active even in the stillness of a photograph. "Your mother?" Clara said. "Yes." Clara looked at it a moment longer, then handed it back with both hands. The 4th finger had returned to full color that morning. "She looks like someone who figured things out." "She was," Mara said. She put the photograph carefully back in the pocket over her heart. "I'm sorry she's not here to see this." Clara said it simply, without ornamentation. Not performing condolence, just saying a thing that seemed true. Mara folded the coat and set it on the ledge she used as a shelf. "She taught me the most important thing," she said. "See what's actually there, not what you expected." Clara considered this. "Is that what you did? With the cave?" Nobody else saw anything here. They saw a failed ridge and bad soil and a useless cave. She looked at the cave around her, the fireplace, the water, the growing things in the back, the animals settled and alive. "I saw what was actually there. Underground water," Clara said slowly, working through it. "Natural insulation, stable temperature, soil that nobody else had bothered to move. A place where the wind couldn't reach," Mara said. "That's the whole thing, really. Up here, the wind is the enemy. Everything else is manageable if you get out of the wind." Clara looked at the cave ceiling. At the solid rock above them, hundreds of feet of mountain holding the storm at arm's length. "The town has been talking about you." Mara waited. "People who heard about a girl living in a cave on Hollow Ridge." Clara paused. "The conversation was not always kind." "I know what the conversation was." "I participated in some of it," Clara said, with the particular flatness of someone making a confession they've earned the right to make only by not softening it. "At the Ladies' Aid Society meeting in November, someone mentioned you and I—" She looked at her hands. "I said something to the effect that some people don't know their limitations." The fire moved. Outside, somewhere below the ridge, something shifted in the post-storm landscape. A tree settling into its new position, or a drift finding a new angle. "You were probably not wrong," Mara said, "that most people in my situation wouldn't have made it work." "That's not—" Clara started. I know it's not an excuse," Mara said. "I'm not offering it as one. I'm saying that what you thought was reasonable given what you knew. Most people who come to a failed ridge with $17 don't survive the first month." She looked at Clara directly. "I'm not most people. That's not arrogance. It's just the thing I've had to figure out about myself." Clara Holloway looked at her for a long moment. She had, Mara thought, the eyes of someone who'd spent a significant portion of her life in the company of people saying things they believed and watching them be right or wrong about themselves. She recognized a particular quality in the look. Not judgment, or not only judgment, something more like measurement. "No," Clara said finally. "You are not." Edwin spent most of the day looking. He moved through the cave space with a systematic attention that was, she recognized, the same attention she brought to her own inventory checks. He examined the water channel and followed it to its source in the east wall. He crouched by the potato beds and looked at the soil composition. He spent a long time at the fireplace, examining the chimney construction with his fingers as well as his eyes. He looked at her stored provisions and the order she'd kept them in. He looked at the structural elements of the lean-to section from the inside. He did not do any of this with the attitude of someone who was going to offer corrections. He did it the way someone walks through a new country, taking inventory of what's there. In the early afternoon, while Clara slept and Cale worked on a section of pen fencing that had shifted in the storm vibrations, Edwin came and sat near the fire where Mara was working on her boot. The seam that had opened at the heel 5 days after her arrival had opened again, wider this time, along the same line but extending further. She was attempting to restitch it with a needle she'd made from a thin piece of bone and thread she'd pulled from the hem of her second spare shirt, which was now almost entirely consumed by the various needs of the homestead. He watched her work for a minute. "Can I ask you something?" "You've been asking me things all day," she said. "One more won't surprise me." "Why didn't you trade the deed?" He said it without any preparation. "When Harold gave it to you, Tom Ackley and half the town told you to sell it. You could have gotten $30. You could have gone somewhere easier." She kept her eyes on the stitching. The bone needle was imperfect. It had a tendency to bend in the wrong direction at the worst moment. $30 doesn't last forever, she said. Land does. A lot of people would say that logic doesn't apply to land that can't support you. A lot of people hadn't looked at the land. He sat with that. "You knew, when you first came up here, that it would work?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. She thought about the first night, the fire she'd built at the cave mouth, the breathing outside, the axe handle in her hand. The moment she'd heard the water. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought it was possible. There's a difference." She found the end of her thread and tied it off. "I knew that going somewhere else with $30 was definitely not going to work. And I knew that nobody else had looked at this land carefully. So I thought I'd look at it carefully. And if you'd looked and found nothing, then I'd have had to come up with a different plan." She bit the thread and pulled the boot back on to test the seam. It held. "But I try not to make plans based on what I'll do if things don't work. You can think about it too much, and it gets in the way of doing the work." Edwin was quiet for a while. The fire moved between them. "I have a proposition," he said. She looked up. "Not charity," he said immediately, with a directness she was starting to understand was simply how he operated. "A business arrangement. I supply what you said you needed. The grain, the thermometer, seed stock for spring. In exchange, you give me first right of trade on anything you produce from this operation. Pelts, eggs, eventually wool, eventually whatever the garden produces." She looked at him. "That's a generous arrangement. It's a reasonable one. I'm a merchant. I trade in what people need. What you're building here is something people are going to want access to. Seed knowledge, winter survival techniques. The underground water system alone is worth." He stopped himself from going further in a direction that was apparently getting ahead of the negotiation. "I'm not being charitable. I'm seeing an investment." She sat with the proposition for longer than she'd have let herself sit with most things, because she'd learned that decisions made quickly from a position of need tended to look different in the morning. "First right of trade," she said. "Not exclusive." He nodded. "First right." "And I set the prices." He looked at her. "I know what my goods are worth," she said. "I traded 7 pelts to Dolores Fenn 2 weeks ago, and I watched her face when she looked at them. I know what she'd have paid if I'd pushed harder." She met his eyes. "I didn't push harder then because I needed to move fast, and she'd done me a kindness in November. With you, we're starting even." Edwin Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out his hand. She shook it. "You set the prices," he said. The morning they left, it was cold and clear. The sky so hard and blue it looked breakable. The snow had consolidated overnight, and the drifts had settled into their new positions, which made the upper path manageable if you watched where you put your feet. Cale Denton's knee was bad enough that he was moving with a stick he'd cut from the lean-to's spare lumber, which he carried without comment and used without apology. Clara wore both their spare dry cloths wrapped around her hands, which Mara had insisted on, and which Clara hadn't argued about, which told her something about how Clara Holloway was feeling about her own judgment this morning versus 2 days ago. Edwin had spent the previous evening going through his notebook and then going through it again, and he'd presented Mara with a supply list, what he'd bring, when he'd bring it, how he valued the grain relative to what she'd already described offering in trade, with the organized clarity of a man who'd been doing this for 11 years and was applying his full professional attention to it. She'd read it twice, made 2 changes, and signed it with the pencil stub on the back of a receipt he'd found in his coat pocket. He'd countersigned it. Neither of them had remarked on the fact that a signed receipt meant something because they both intended it to. She stood at the cave entrance and watched the 3 of them make their way down the first section of the path. Cale moved carefully but steadily. Clara kept close to Edwin on the steeper parts. Edwin turned once when they reached the first switchback and looked back up at the cave. She was still standing there. She raised one hand briefly. He nodded. Then he turned back to the path and kept going. She stood there until they disappeared below the tree line. The sound of their movement, careful footsteps on consolidated snow, the tap of Cale's stick, carried for a while in the cold air, then faded. Then the ridge was quiet. It was the particular quiet of after, different from the quiet she'd grown accustomed to in the weeks before the storm, different even from the post-blizzard silence of the previous day. This quiet had weight to it, the weight of everything that had happened in the last 3 days still sitting in the air. She went inside. The cave held the warmth of 4 people's bodies for hours after they were gone. That was the thing about stone. It remembered. She stoked the fire anyway, because management didn't stop being necessary just because things had gone well. She checked the potato beds, where the pale shoots were continuing their slow insistence on existing. She checked Ruth, who seemed to have opinions about the recent disruption to her routine that she expressed through posture rather than sound. She checked the hens, counted the eggs she'd set aside during the last 2 days for eating later because she hadn't wanted to reduce portions further. 2 eggs. A good portion for a person alone. She cooked them over the fire with a small quantity of corn and ate sitting near the heat with her back against the cave wall that she'd first sat against in early November, when the cave was dark and strange, and she was listening to an underground stream and trying to understand what she actually had. She'd been here 8 weeks. She had a functioning fireplace and a water system and animals alive through a blizzard that had, from what Cale had said, stopped most of what was below the ridge. She had potato beds with pale growing things in them, and a signed receipt in Edwin Holloway's careful handwriting, and a proposition that would, if it held, move her from the edge of sufficient to something more durable. She also had a cracked chimney that still needed a full rebuild, a lean-to roof that would need resealing, provisions that were lower than she wanted, and a list that never seemed to get shorter, only to redistribute its contents. She added chimney rebuild to the top and looked at the whole list for a minute. Then she folded the envelope, put it in her coat pocket, and got up to start on it. The afternoon was clean and cold and quiet. She worked until the light went, and then she worked by firelight a little longer than she should have, because the chimney section she was in the middle of was at a stage where stopping partway would be worse than finishing it, and she finished it and checked it and found it solid. She banked the fire for the night. Outside, the stars were out over the ridge in the sharp winter clarity that only comes after a storm has cleaned the air down to nothing. She stood at the cave entrance for a moment and looked at them, not with any particular feeling about them, just looking, the way you look at something when you've finished a hard day and have a moment to look at anything. The underground stream kept its voice behind her in the rock. Ruth shifted in her pen. One of the hens made a small sleeping sound. Mara went inside and closed the door on the cold. Edwin Holloway came back 11 days after the blizzard, as he'd said he would. Mara heard the mule before she saw him. The particular sound of a loaded animal picking its way up uncertain ground, the creak of a pack frame under weight. She was outside splitting deadfall when the sound reached her, and she set the axe down and stood listening to confirm it was what she thought it was before she let herself react to it. She'd learned over the past weeks not to react to things before she'd confirmed them. The ridge had a way of offering sounds that meant one thing and turned out to be another. It was Edwin. He came up the last section of the path with a mule carrying 2 full pack bags and a canvas-wrapped bundle strapped across the top. And he was moving with the careful attention of a town man on winter ground who did not want to fall and knew it. He saw her standing by the woodpile and raised a hand. She raised one back. He'd brought everything on the list, all of it, the grain for Ruth, and the hens in a quantity that extended her calculations by 6 weeks. The thermometer in a wooden case that she handled with more care than she'd have admitted to, 3 varieties of seed stock he'd sourced from a farm supply contact in Mill Haven, because Callow's Creek didn't carry all of them, and 2 additional items she hadn't asked for, a proper felling axe to replace the hand axe she'd been doing everything with since November, and a tin of rendered tallow for candles, which was the kind of thing that you didn't realize you needed until you'd been rationing candlelight for 2 months, and then someone gave you more of it, and the relief was disproportionate. She looked at the felling axe for a long moment. She picked it up, felt the balance of it. "That wasn't on the list," she said. "Consider it an amendment," Edwin said. "I watched you split wood with that hand axe for 3 days. A person shouldn't have to work that hard for something that doesn't require it." She looked at him. "We agreed I set the prices." "You do." What's your price for the axe? She thought about it. 2 rabbit pelts, cured, when I have them ready. Done, he said, without negotiating. She noted that. He stayed for most of the afternoon, not intrusively, but with the quality of someone who had things to observe and questions he'd been thinking about since the last visit. He looked at the chimney rebuild she'd completed in the days since the storm, running his hand along the new clay work. He checked the draft with a piece of paper without being asked, which told her he'd been paying attention when she'd done it. He looked at the potato beds, where 2 of the original plantings had now put out secondary growth strong enough that she was cautiously optimistic about them, and at the new 4th bed where the last reserve potato had become something real. The thermometer, he said, when she showed him the reading in the back section of the cave. 43 degrees back here. I thought it was around 40. Good to know exactly. He wrote it in his notebook. She watched him write it and thought about what he was building toward with all the notes he'd been taking, the questions, the observations, the careful inventory of everything she'd figured out by necessity over the past 2 months. Are you writing something? She said. He looked up. What do you mean? About this. About what I've done here. You take notes like a man who's collecting something. I was quiet for a moment, long enough that she understood he'd been deciding how to answer. I know 3 families who are planning to homestead in this county come spring, he said. Families who've been told the land here is difficult, which it is. But what you've done, the insulation approach, the underground temperature management, the water system, these aren't things anyone out here is teaching. He looked at her directly. I thought someone should write it down. She sat with that. You could have asked, she said. I was waiting to see if you'd make it through winter, he said, with an honesty that was almost blunt. Writing down the methods of someone who doesn't survive the winter isn't useful. Writing down the methods of someone who does is. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, when you write it down plain, not as something remarkable, just as things that work and why they work. Why? Because if it reads like something remarkable, people will think it's something only a particular kind of person can do. If it reads like things that work, people will try them. Edwin looked at her with the expression she'd started to recognize, that upward recalibration, the small shift when he encountered something from her that he hadn't anticipated. He wrote something in the notebook. She went back to work. February came in cold and stayed cold, but it was a different cold than January. Less aggressive, more settled, the kind of cold that has accepted its position and stopped trying to prove anything. The blizzard had been the worst of it, Mara understood now. What remained was still serious and still required attention, but it was manageable in the way that most serious things are manageable once you understand their actual shape rather than the shape you'd been afraid they were. The potato beds produced in the 2nd week of February, not abundantly. She wasn't going to pretend they produced abundantly, because they didn't. What they produced was a first harvest that yielded enough for 6 full meals, which she counted carefully, and which tasted, she thought while eating the first one, like the physical form of the word vindicated. She ate it plain, boiled in the tin cup, sitting by the fire at the end of a day that had been long and not particularly dramatic, and she let herself feel it without qualification. The 4th bed, the one she'd replanted after the first potato rotted, the one she'd pressed in with the last of what she had, produced slightly more than the others. She didn't have an explanation for that. Sometimes the thing you did out of necessity and without much hope worked out better than the thing you'd planned carefully. She filed that away without making too much of it. The hens were producing more reliably now, say 2 eggs most days, occasionally 3, which she attributed partly to the extra grain Edwin had supplied, and partly to the fact that the cave's stable temperature was easier on them than she'd realized a fluctuating environment would have been. Ruth's fleece had come in thick enough that she could see, clearly for the first time, what spring shearing was going to produce. She'd been reading about wool processing in the almanac, which covered it in the same compressed assume-you-already-know fashion as everything else in the almanac, and she'd been supplementing with what Cale Denton had told her when he'd visited in the 2nd week of January. He'd come up alone, on a day that was clear but very cold, walking with less of a limp than she'd expected. He'd brought nothing except himself and a question. "Still here," he said, when she opened the lean-to entrance. "Still here," she confirmed. He'd come inside and they'd sat by the fire and he'd asked, in the careful way she was starting to understand was actually his natural register, rather than the easy performance she'd seen in Garrett's store. What she was doing about the wool. "I haven't sheared her yet," she said. "Spring." "You know how?" "I know the principle." He'd almost smiled at that. The principle and the practice are pretty far apart on that one. He'd looked at his hands. "I shear my own animals. Goats mostly, but the technique's similar. I can come up when it's time if you want." She'd looked at him for a moment. "Why?" The question didn't seem to surprise him. "Because you helped me when you didn't have to," he said, "and because I'd like to." He paused. "And because watching you figure things out is—" He seemed to reach for the right word and not find it. "It's not a hardship," he said finally. She'd looked at him long enough that he'd apparently decided the silence meant something he wasn't sure about, because he'd added, "That's not— I don't mean anything by it except what I said." "I know," she said. "Come in April, when the weather's right for it." He'd nodded, and they'd talked about other things. His trap lines, the recovery of the Lower Ridge homesteads after the blizzard, what he'd heard about Dolores Fenn's expanded spring inventory. And it had been, she noticed afterward, the most comfortable conversation she'd had in a long time. Not because it was easy, because it was real, conducted between two people who were not performing anything for each other. The first visitor, who was not Edwin or Cale, came in the third week of February. She was outside checking the snow drainage channel when she heard someone coming up the path. A different sound than Edwin's mule, lighter and faster, someone on foot moving with purpose. She stayed where she was and waited. The woman who came around the last bend of the path was maybe 30, carrying a child on her hip, and a determined expression that suggested she'd been climbing for a while and had no intention of stopping now. She saw Mara and stopped, and for a moment they looked at each other across the snow. "You're Mara Whitlock," the woman said. "Yes. My name is Sarah Pelton. My husband and I have 40 acres on the south face, below the tree line." She shifted the child on her hip. "We lost our root cellar in the blizzard. Roof came down. Lost most of our stored vegetables." She looked at Mara directly. "I heard you grew potatoes through the winter. I wanted to know how." Mara looked at the child, maybe 2 years old, regarding her with the frank assessment of very small people. Then she looked at Sarah Pelton, who had climbed a winter ridge with a 2-year-old on her hip to ask a question, which told Mara something specific and important about the kind of woman she was dealing with. "Come inside," she said. "It's easier to explain with the beds in front of you." Sarah Pelton stayed 3 hours. She asked questions the way someone asks questions when they're building something in their mind, sequentially, making sure each piece was solid before adding the next. She looked at the water system and the temperature readings Mara had been marking on the cave wall with charcoal since the thermometer arrived. She looked at the soil composition, picking it up and rubbing it between her fingers. She listened to the underground stream. When she left, she carried a quantity of seed potatoes that Mara had set aside from the February harvest. Not many, but enough to start 3 beds of her own if she followed the method Mara had laid out. She also carried a piece of paper on which Mara had written the temperatures and the soil amendment process and the drainage considerations in her small, careful handwriting. She'd given away part of her seed stock. This was something she'd made a decision about somewhere in the middle of the explanation without announcing it. She could have given only information and kept the seeds. The math argued for keeping the seeds. But Sarah Pelton had a 2-year-old and a ruined root cellar and 40 acres she was trying to make work, and the seeds would make the method real for her in a way that the information alone might not. She watched Sarah Pelton disappear below the tree line and then stood there for a moment longer. Her mother had shown things to people, quietly, practically, not as gifts but as tools. Here is how this works. Now you have it. Mara hadn't thought about that in years, and thinking about it now felt like catching sight of something from the corner of her eye that disappeared when you looked directly at it. She let it go and went inside. March was mud and melt, and the particular exhaustion of late winter, when the hardest part is over but the body hasn't been told yet. The snow came off the ridge in stages, revealing the work she'd done in a kind of slow inventory. The drainage channels she'd cut were holding their shape. The lean-to had survived the freeze-thaw cycle better than she'd dared hope. And the surface soil around the cave entrance, exposed now for the first time since November, showed the beginning of what she'd been working toward. The organic material she'd been building into it over months of effort had changed the texture of the top layer visibly, darkening it, making it hold moisture differently. It wasn't good soil yet, but it was better soil than it had been, which was the point. Edwin came in mid-March with the second supply installment as they'd agreed, and this time he brought news along with grain. He came inside and accepted hot water and sat across the fire from her with the manner of someone carrying something they're deciding how to lead with. "There are people asking about you," he said. "Asking what?" "Asking to come up." He wrapped both hands around the cup. The Pelton woman talked, and Cale talked. Not much, you know how he is, but enough. And I told the Whitmore family what I'd seen here because they're the ones planning to homestead on the north section, and they were asking me what to expect. He looked at her. "The interest is genuine, Mara. People want to know what you know." She was quiet for a moment. "How many people?" "Currently? 4 families with specific questions. Probably more by spring when the road opens fully." She thought about Sarah Pelton's hands on the soil, the quality of attention she'd brought. She thought about Edwin's notebook. She thought about what it would mean for the operation of her homestead to have a regular stream of visitors, the disruption of it, the time it would take. She also thought about the winter that had just passed, about what it would have looked like for the South Face homesteaders if the blizzard had found them all as unprepared as the conditions suggested, about the Pelton child on Sarah's hip. "One at a time," she said. "No more than 1 family a week. And I need notice in advance. Send word through you. They can leave a message at your store. You pass it up to me when you come." She paused. "I'm not running a school. I'm running a homestead. People can come and look at what I'm doing, and I'll explain it, but I'm not stopping my work to do it," Edwin wrote in the notebook. "Also," she said. He looked up. "If anyone comes up here and tells me they heard about me from the Ladies' Aid Society, I'm going to need a moment before I can be civil about it." He almost laughed. It was the first time she'd seen him come close. "Clara told you about that?" "Clara told me." "For what it's worth," he said, "Clara's account of what she said has changed significantly from the original version. It gets more unflattering to herself each time she tells it." "That's her business," Mara said. "I don't hold it against her. I just need a moment is all." Cale came in April, as he'd said he would. He came on the first genuinely warm day the ridge had had since October, the kind of day that feels like an argument for why you stayed, clear and sharp, and carrying the particular smell of snowmelt and new growth that arrives every spring like a thing that had forgotten it was coming back. He came up the path without a limp, which she noticed and didn't comment on. He was carrying his shearing tools in a canvas roll. Ruth, for her part, had opinions about the shearing process that she expressed loudly and at length. She was not a cooperative animal. She had never claimed to be a cooperative animal. But Cale knew what he was doing, the calm, unhurried competence of someone who'd done this particular difficult thing many times. And between his experience and Mara's knowledge of Ruth's specific stubbornness, they managed it without anyone getting hurt, which Mara marked as a qualified success. The fleece, spread out on the flat rock outside the cave entrance in the spring morning, was more than she'd expected. Cale looked at it with a practiced eye. "Good weight," he said. "Clean. You kept her in good condition." "She kept herself in good condition mostly," Mara said. "I just made sure she had what she needed." He gathered the fleece into a bundle. "You know the processing?" "I've been reading about it." "Reading about it," he repeated, with the tone she'd heard before from him. Not quite amusement, but close. "I know," she said. "The principle and the practice. Come down to my place sometime and I'll show you the practice." He said it without looking at her, which was its own kind of honesty. "I've got the carding equipment and the small wheel. You can bring the fleece, we can work through it together." She looked at the ridge in the morning light, at the surface soil that was beginning to show green at the edges where she'd been amending it since the first thaw, at the lean-to standing solid, the smoke hole she'd improved over the winter drawing cleaner now, at the evidence of 8 months of work, visible in every direction she looked. "All right," she said. He looked at her then, just briefly. "All right," he said. The first thing she planted in the amended surface soil was spinach, because the almanac said it was cold-tolerant, and she'd been waiting to test the surface bed since December. She pressed the seeds in with her thumb on a morning in late April, when the temperature had held above freezing for 6 consecutive nights, which was the threshold she'd settled on, and then she did what she'd learned to do with uncertain things. She went and worked on something else, and let it be uncertain without standing over it. The seeds came up in 11 days. Not all of them, about 60%, which was not perfect but was real, was actually happening in the soil she'd built from what had been a rockscape. She crouched by the first small green rows and looked at them for a long time. She thought about the November morning she'd arrived. about the thin deed in her pocket and $17 and a boot seam that rubbed and a cave nobody had ever made anything out of. About the distance between that morning and this one, measured not in miles or months but in decisions. 1,000 small ones, most of them made without anyone watching, most of them made wrong the first time and right the second. She thought about Harold Whitlock's voice saying, "Don't come back," with the flat relief of a man setting down a weight. She tried to locate some anger in herself about it, the way you probe a bruise to see if it still hurts, and found something that wasn't quite anger anymore. It wasn't forgiveness either. She didn't have the particular generosity in her for that. Not yet, maybe not ever about this specific thing. It was something quieter, more like distance. The space between who she'd been on the porch that morning and who she was crouching in April soil looking at spinach she'd grown from a mended rock ground. The distance was enormous. The distance was everything. The visitors started coming in May. The Whitmore family came first, as Edwin had arranged. A couple in their 40s with 2 teenage sons, and the specific combination of determination and uncertainty that characterized people who'd made a large decision and were still making peace with it. They spent most of a day at Hollow Ridge, and Mara showed them what she'd built and explained what she'd learned. And at the end of the day, the husband, a quiet man named George, looked at the cave entrance and the expanded lean-to structure and the surface beds with their rows of green and said, "How did you know it would work?" She thought about it. "I didn't know the whole thing would work," she said. "I knew each piece well enough to try it. The water was real. The temperature was real. The soil was possible. I put the pieces together and worked on them until they stopped being possible and started being actual." He nodded slowly. "We've got a limestone formation on our property that everyone says is a liability. Have you looked at what's inside it?" He hadn't. "Look at what's inside it," she said. The Pelton family came in the second week of May, with Sarah carrying a baby that hadn't been visible yet when she'd climbed the ridge in February. Clearly the reason she'd been so determined to solve the food storage problem, Mara thought, though she didn't say so. Her 3 beds had been planted and were producing, Sarah reported, better than she'd dared expect. She'd brought preserves as trade, 6 jars of last summer's berry preserve she'd been keeping carefully. And Mara accepted them, and they sat outside in the May sun on the flat rock where she'd spread Ruth's fleece a few weeks before, and talked for an hour about soil and drainage and what the amended beds might yield by summer. Dolores Fenn came in the 3rd week of May, and she came alone, which was either a sign of genuine interest or a sign that she hadn't wanted to be seen making the trip, and Mara suspected both. Dolores looked at everything with the cataloging attention that appeared to be her primary mode of engaging with the world. She examined the water system with particular interest, following the channel with her eyes and asking about flow rate and seasonal variation. She spent a long time looking at the amended surface beds. "You turn that," she said, pointing at the section that had been bare rock 8 months ago. "Built it up from below," Mara said. "Organic material from the cave, minerals from the stream deposits, worked in over winter." Dolores looked at it. "My late husband spent 20 years trying to get this county's surface soil to do something useful. He'd have wanted to talk to you." She said it simply, without sentiment that wasn't real, and Mara received it the same way. "He sounds like someone who understood that the land gives you what's actually there," Mara said, "not what you want to be there." "That was exactly him," Dolores said quietly. She stayed for the afternoon. Before she left, she put 2 things on Mara's supply shelf: a proper steel needle and thread, real thread, a spool of it, not the ragged supply Mara had been working with, and a small glass jar of something amber-colored. "Honey," Dolores said, "from my neighbor's bees. You should keep bees up here eventually. The flowers on the south-facing slope would—" She stopped herself. "That's probably not helpful right now." "It's useful to think about," Mara said. "I'll write it down." Dolores looked at her. "You really do write everything down. Everything that matters." Dolores looked around the cave one more time, at the evidence of a winter survived and a spring built on top of it, and she said, in the same plain-spoken register she'd always used, "I told Garrett I'd revise my opinion if you made it to December with the animals alive." "I remember," Mara said. "It's May," Dolores said. "I've revised my opinion." Harold Whitlock came in June. She knew he was coming because Edwin sent word 3 days ahead, a brief note that said only, "Your uncle is asking about the road to the ridge. I thought you should know." She spent those 3 days in a state she wouldn't have called dread, exactly, but that had some of dread's qualities. A watchfulness, a low-level awareness of something unresolved moving toward resolution. He came on a Tuesday, mid-morning, and he looked older than she remembered, 8 months older, which shouldn't have been visible, but it was. He'd always been a man who looked like he was managing several things simultaneously and finding all of them slightly more than he wanted to deal with. And that quality had deepened, she thought. He stopped at the edge of the flat area in front of the lean-to and looked at the homestead. He looked for a long time. She waited. "Mara," he said. "Harold," she said. He looked at the surface beds, at the lean-to structure, at the chimney smoke drawing clean from the cave into the morning air. He looked at Ruth in the small outdoor pen she'd built once the snow was gone, and at the hens moving in the expanded enclosure, and at the spinach and the other greens already coming in from the amended beds. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't help him. "Your father's land," he said finally. "He always said it was worthless. My father never came up here and looked," she said. "No offense to his memory." Harold was quiet. "You've done something here." "Yes." "I didn't think—" "I know what you thought," she said. Not with anger, just as a fact. "You thought I'd fail and come back, and eventually you'd have to deal with the guilt of that, or I'd fail and not come back, and eventually you'd have to deal with a different kind of guilt. Either way, you gave me the deed so you could stop being responsible for what happened." He looked at her. The direct statement of it seemed to land on him with a weight he hadn't been prepared to receive standing up. "That's not entirely—" "Harold," she said it evenly. "You told me not to come back. I didn't come back. This is my place. If you came up here to tell me you're sorry, I appreciate it, and it's done, and we can move on. If you came up here for something else, I need to know what." He looked at the ground. He was wearing his good boots, which meant he'd prepared for this in his way. "I came to see if you were all right," he said. She looked at him. He was a man with 4 children and a wife who'd tucked herbs into her niece's pack without telling him, and a face that showed the wear of a winter that had been hard on everyone in the county. And he was standing on her land asking if she was all right. She wasn't going to perform mercy for him, but she also wasn't going to perform bitterness because she'd discovered over 8 months of serious work that bitterness was expensive to maintain, and she had other things to spend that energy on. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm more than all right." She let him see it. All of it. The whole homestead, the whole 8 months of work, everything she'd built and learned and figured out. She showed him the cave with the same directness she'd shown every other visitor. No more warmth and no more coldness. He stood at the entrance to the cave and looked at the potato beds and the water system and the fireplace, and Ruth watching him from her pen with the same dignified assessment she gave everyone. "Your Aunt Ruth," he said, noting the name on the pen post where Mara had carved it. "She earned it," Mara said. Something moved across Harold's face that might have been close to a smile. He stood there a moment longer. Then he turned to her and said, with the awkward directness of a man who doesn't have many words for this kind of thing, and knows it. "I wasn't fair to you after your father died. It should have been better." She looked at him. "I know," she said. That was all. He seemed to understand that was all there was going to be, and he accepted it with the posture of a man who'd known, coming up the ridge, that he didn't have the right to expect more than that. He left in the early afternoon. She watched him go down the path and thought about what she felt, and what she found was something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not triumph, not the clean satisfaction of a completed score. Something quieter. More like the way you feel when you finally put down something heavy you've been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. The absence of the thing more than the thing itself. She went back inside and added to her list. The summer built on itself the way she'd believed it would, and also differently than she'd imagined, because the things that go differently than imagined are the rule rather than the exception, and she'd made her peace with that. The surface beds produced throughout June and July. Not abundantly, not the rich harvest of genuinely good farmland, but steadily, enough. The potato beds in the cave had gone through 2 full cycles by midsummer, producing in quantities that had moved from experiment to reliable supply. She'd expanded them by 2 beds, which required more soil amendment and more time, and produced results on the slower end of her estimates, which she documented carefully. Ruth was bred in the early summer. Cale had a ram, as it turned out, which was information that had emerged naturally and been acted on practically, the way most useful information between them was exchanged. The result would be visible in the spring, which was a category of future she was getting comfortable thinking about. Cale came up regularly through the summer. Not every week. He had his own operation to run, his own rhythms, his own particular relationship with the ridge and the high country above it. But regularly, and the visits had settled into something she didn't have an exact name for and didn't feel the need to name. He fixed the thing on the south side of the lean-to roof that she'd identified in the spring and hadn't been able to reach safely alone. She helped him repair a section of trail below the ridge that affected both of them. They worked alongside each other with the ease of two people who'd stopped needing to explain themselves and could just work. One evening in late July, they sat outside on the flat rock in the cooling air after a day that had been genuinely hot. Unusual at the elevation, but not unheard of. And she was looking out at the country below the ridge, at the particular gold the light made of everything at that hour. And he said without much preparation, "Are you going to stay?" She looked at him. "Why would I leave?" "I don't know. Some people, when they've proved what they set out to prove, He seemed to think about how to finish that. They move on to the next thing. "This is the next thing," she said. "This is all the things." She looked at the homestead around her, the evidence of 9 months visible in every direction, the soil she'd built, and the structure she'd built, and the knowledge she'd built, and the beginnings of something that was starting to look less like survival and more like a life. "I didn't come here to prove anything. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and this was what I had. And now?" She thought about it honestly. "Now I have more than I had, and I understand it better. The work hasn't changed. It just has more to show for it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same country she was looking at. "It's a good place," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw that before anyone else did." The sun went lower. The ridge caught the last of it on the rock faces, the same rock she'd pressed her palm against in November and felt the earth's warmth coming up through it. The warmth that had nothing to do with her and that she'd understood, the moment she felt it, was the thing that was going to make the difference. She thought about that first night. The fire at the cave mouth, the breathing outside, the $17 in her pocket, and the deed in the envelope, and the whole enormous unknown stretching out in every direction. She didn't think about it the way she used to, as a measure of how hard it had been. She thought about it the way you think about the first step of a long walk. Not the hardest part necessarily, just the beginning, the moment where everything was still possible because nothing had been attempted yet. What she'd learned over 9 months on a ridge that had defeated everyone who came before her was not a technique or a set of methods, though she'd developed those too and written them down so they'd be useful to someone else. What she'd learned was something harder to write down and easier to lose if you weren't careful about protecting it. The land was not what people said it was. The cave was not what people said it was. She was not what people said she was. The work of her life, she understood now, was not proving that to anyone else. The work was simply seeing clearly what was actually there, not what you expected, not what someone else had decided before you arrived. Seeing clearly and then acting on what you saw, and not stopping when it was hard, and not stopping when people laughed, and not stopping when your own exhaustion told you to. Her mother had known this, had tried to give it to her in the form of a single sentence on a riverbank when she was 10 years old. She'd received it. She'd carried it here. She'd used it to build something that was going to outlast the winter, and the winter after that, and the judgments of the people who'd never bothered to come up the ridge and look. Cale picked up the tin cup he'd been holding and looked at the last light on the far ranges. The hens were settling in for the night somewhere behind them. Ruth made the sound she made when the day was ending, and she approved of how it was ending. "I'll come up Saturday," Cale said. "There's a stretch of trail below the second switchback that's been washing out. Needs stacking before the fall rains." "I'll have the material ready," she said. He nodded. He got up with the economy of movement that was his, said goodnight, and headed down the path. She listened to his footsteps until they faded below the tree line. The ridge held the last light long after everything below it had gone to shadow. That was the thing about being up high. You got more of the light, held it longer, watched it move across the country in the last minutes of the day in a way you simply couldn't see from the valley floor. Mara sat on the flat rock until it was gone. Then she went inside, banked the fire, checked the animals, read the temperature on the thermometer in the back of the cave, 44 degrees, a degree warmer than winter, the earth holding its summer heat in the stone, and pulled the envelope from her coat pocket. She sat looking at the list for a minute. At everything checked and unchecked, the months of inventory compressed into a small envelope's worth of handwriting, the whole arc of 9 months visible if you knew how to read it. She turned the envelope over. She wrote on the back, "What's actually there?" She looked at it for a moment, then she folded it